The rifles came up before the sun cleared the slag heaps, and Wren Calloway watched the 7 muzzles settle on her chest without moving her feet. Frost silvered the cobbles of Sable Creek's market square. Somewhere behind the garrison line, a mining klaxon groaned through its dawn cycle, indifferent to the fact that the square had been cleared of carts and crates, and filled instead with colonists standing shoulder to shoulder behind a rope, and a woman standing alone in front of a wall the color of wet ash. Her wrists were bound behind her with a compact restraint band, black polymer, humming faintly where it met her pulse. Her militia jacket had been stripped for the record. She wore the undershirt, the mud, and nothing else, and she was not shaking. "Face front," said the voice behind the firing line. "You will not be permitted last words." "I don't need them," Wren said. "You need mine more than I do." The voice belonged to Warden Prefect Asa Vrail, a Ketran of the Threll Compact garrison staff, chitin the color of a bruise gone old, mandibles clicking once in something that might have been irritation and might have been the cold. Vrail stood off to the side of the firing line with a data slate in one clawed hand, reading from a sentence that had already been recorded, filed, and would be broadcast to 4 other colonies on this side of the 9th Register before local noon. The 9th Register was the Compact's own word for this world harrow, the colonists called it, but on every Compact manifest it was listed as Provisional World 94, Hazard Index rising, ascending, do not deploy soft caste personnel below rank 3 without escort. Sable Creek was the 4th settlement the Compact had garrisoned since making landfall 11 months ago. It was, on paper, pacified. On paper. Vrail did not look up from the slate. Corporal Wren Calloway, Sable Creek Militia, charged with the deaths of 6 Compact personnel during the ambush at the Copper Fork checkpoint, charged with continued material support to unlawful resistance elements. Sentence: public execution by firing detail, to be observed by the civilian population as a demonstration of consequence. Vrail's compound eyes caught the weak dawn light in 100 amber facets. "You may address the colonists. You may not address me." "I wasn't planning to," Wren said. "I was talking to them." She tilted her chin very slightly toward the 7 Ketran soldiers standing in a loose line 8 meters off, rifles raised, stocks tucked into the reinforced ridges along their upper thoraxes. Their eyes were not on Vrail. They were on her. "You're the ones who have to live with what happens next. He just has to read it off a slate." One of the 7, young, the chitin on his flank still faintly soft-edged with adolescence, a private by the single copper band on his wrist guard, shifted his weight. It was a small thing. Vrail did not see it. Wren did. She had been in this position, or one close enough to it, exactly once before, 4 years ago and 11,000 light-years distant from anywhere that mattered anymore, kneeling in the frozen mud of a training yard, while a man twice her age held a rifle on her and told her that pain was information, not injury, and that the two were only the same thing if she let them be. Silas Boone had been an old man even then, 71 winters into a life that had started on a very different earth, and he had made her dislocate her own thumb 11 times before she stopped flinching on the 12th. "The body will believe whatever you tell it," he'd said, wrapping her hand afterward with the patient, unhurried competence of someone who had wrapped a great many hands. "Yours especially. You were built stubborn. Use it." She had used it in the transport 3 hours ago, in the dark, with a Ketran guard dozing 4 feet away and her wrists already zip-bound behind her back. It had taken 40 seconds and made almost no sound. The restraint band on her right wrist was hardened polymer, rated to 60 kilonewtons, plenty to hold a human wrist. It was not rated to hold a human wrist that no longer had a bone running through the center of it in the shape the band expected. It hurt. Silas had never promised it wouldn't hurt. He'd only promised that hurt wasn't the same as stopped. "Ready?" Sergeant Dune Calver called from the end of the firing line, and 7 rifles found their aim points again, more precisely this time, sighting down barrels that had been calibrated. The colony's medical logs said, against Ketran anatomy, dual hearts stacked low in the thorax, a nerve ganglion behind what would be a human's collarbone. Nobody in the garrison had ever bothered to update the calibration for a species whose heart sat where a Ketran's stomach did, whose vital organs were tucked into a completely different architecture, because nobody had needed to. Compact doctrine held that any target, shot enough times in the center of visible mass, died. Compact doctrine had been written by people who had never had to shoot a Deathworlder and watch what didn't happen next. Wren knew this. She had read the same medical logs the garrison had, copied off a dead courier's slate 2 months ago, and she had spent a long night with Silas Boone going over every line of them by candlelight, because information, Silas said, was the only weapon the colony had that the compact couldn't confiscate. "You're aiming for a heart that isn't there," she said, and her voice did not rise. It stayed level, almost bored, the same register she'd have used to tell someone the water pump needed a new gasket. "Center mass on me is lung and stomach wall. You'll put me down. You won't put me out. And then Dune's regulation says somebody has to walk up here and confirm it by hand." She let that sit half a second. Ask him what happened at Verge Station. The mandibles of 3 separate soldiers clicked at once, an involuntary chorus, quickly bitten off. Calver's head swiveled toward Vrail, not toward Wren. A question passed silently between officers that no colonist standing behind the rope could read, but that every soldier on the line understood perfectly. Vrail's antennae flattened back along the skull ridge, the Ketran equivalent. Wren had learned watching this garrison for 11 months, of a jaw going tight. "You don't know anything about Verge Station," Vrail said. "I know your regulation exists because of it," Wren said. "I know regulations don't get written for things that never happened." She rolled her bound shoulders back, an inch unhurried, and looked past the rifles to the line of soldiers holding them, not at their weapons, at their faces, at the compound eyes that could not entirely hide the flicker running through them now like current through wire. "So here's my last word, since the warden prefect says I only get to spend it on you. Go ahead, pull the trigger. All 7 of you, right now together, exactly like the sergeant wants, and then somebody's going to have to come over here and check." Nobody fired. The klaxon behind the slag heaps finished its cycle and went silent, and into that new silence, colder than the frost, Wren Calloway smiled, small, tired, entirely without malice, the smile of a woman who had already done the arithmetic and was simply waiting for everyone else in the square to catch up. "Well," she said, "I'm not getting any younger standing here." Vrail crossed the 6 meters between the sentencing post and the firing line with the quick, clattering gait of a Ketran trying not to look rattled and failing. "Sergeant, why are my soldiers standing at ready arms doing nothing?" Calver's mandibles worked twice before words came out. "Sir," the corporal referenced Verge Station in front of the detail. "The corporal is bound, unarmed, and 30 seconds from dead. The corporal can reference whatever she likes." Vrail turned back toward the line, voice climbing into the register officers used across every species Wren had ever met, the one built to paper over the fact that they too were afraid. "You have your orders. You have your target. Fire on my command." "Sir," Calver did not lower his rifle, but he did not raise his voice to match either. "Respectfully. The regulation on confirmed kill against Deathworld personnel was written after Verge Station specifically, so that officers who were not present at Verge Station would stop giving orders like the one you just gave." It was, Wren thought, watching from the post with the clinical distance of someone cataloging a gauge reading, the single bravest thing she'd heard a compact soldier say in 11 months of occupation. It wasn't disobedience. It was worse, for Vrail. It was a subordinate quoting the warden prefect's own regulations back to him in front of the woman those regulations existed because of. She let the silence work a little longer before she filled it. 11 months you've had this colony," she said, conversational, the tone of someone making small talk at a checkpoint. "You've shot 4 of us for resisting, 2 for theft, 1 for spitting on a garrison flag, which I'll be honest, Warden Prefect, that one always struck me as thin. In all that time, how many of your own people have you lost that weren't in a firefight? Because I count 3. 3 Ketran dead of nothing anybody can explain, weeks after the fact, found alone, found quiet, found in places they shouldn't have gone alone. She tipped her head slightly, and for the first time since the rifles had come up, something in her voice thinned to an edge. You keep filing those as accidents. Ask your medics sometime how many accidents look exactly the same. It wasn't true, not the way she said it. 2 of those deaths had been an actual mining accident and a fight between drunk garrison techs that had nothing to do with the resistance at all. But it didn't have to be true. It only had to be plausible enough that Vrail couldn't check it standing in a town square with 7 rifles pointed at a woman who wasn't dead yet, and plausible enough that 6 colonists behind the rope, several of whom had been involved in exactly the kind of quiet work she was implying, would hear it and understand she was buying something with the lie, and hold their faces still enough not to give it away. She'd learned that particular trick from her mother, who had sold farm equipment for 30 years before the compact ships came, and who used to say that the surest way to make a buyer nervous about walking away from a deal was to describe calmly everything that would happen if he did. Vrail's antennae had gone rigid. You are attempting to manufacture doubt in my command structure. I'm describing your own casualty log, Wren said. You wrote it, I just read it back to you. 4 hours earlier, in the dark of the transport, she had not been nearly this composed, and it did her no good now to pretend otherwise even to herself. Sila's always said the lie you tell an enemy is a tool, the lie you tell yourself is a noose. She had been afraid in the transport. She had been afraid at the Copper Fork checkpoint 2 days before that, crouched behind an overturned ore hauler with Petra Aldana bleeding out beside her from a chest wound that hadn't been survivable even with the field kit, listening to 6 compact rifles converging on their position from 3 directions while she made the decision. Cold, fast. The kind of decision Sila's had spent 2 years training into her hands, so she wouldn't have to make it with her head. To stand up with empty palms raised and walk toward the guns, because Petra was past saving, and the 4 colonists still pinned in the hauler bed behind her were not, and a live prisoner bought a distraction that a dead one couldn't. It had worked. That was the part nobody in the square needed to know. It had worked exactly as intended. The 4 colonists were 3 kilometers from here right now, in the tunnels under the old Fenner shaft, doing something with the 2 crates of demolition charges Wren had spent 6 weeks smuggling out of the garrison's own supply depot, 1 detonator at a time, hidden in ration tins and mining picks, and once, memorably, inside a dead man's boot. She had let herself be captured the way a good poker player lets a hand go, not out of weakness, but because the pot on the table was worth more than the cards in it. Every minute she kept this firing squad arguing with itself in a frozen square was a minute the tunnels under Fenner shaft got a little further along. You have 30 seconds, Vrail said to the line, to remember that you are compact soldiers, and that a corpse is a corpse regardless of species, and that this creature is manipulating you with children's stories exactly the way Deathworlders manipulate everyone, on every world, on every survey report I have ever read. That is the entire skill set. That is the only asterisk skill set. There is no secret. There is no monster behind the woman. There is a woman with a mouth and 7 rifles, and if none of you can do the arithmetic on which of those wins, you have no business wearing that uniform. He swept the data slate down through the air like a blade. Ready arms. 7 rifles came back up to full aim, and this time, Wren noted with the same flat attentiveness she'd have used counting inventory, they came up faster than before. Vrail's speech had worked. A little, the way officers' speeches usually did, not because it was true but because fear needed somewhere to go and anger at the person threatening you was always the path of least resistance. She let her eyes travel down the line once more before it happened. 6 faces set into the particular stillness of Ketran soldiers steeling themselves. 1 face, the young one, copper wristband, adolescent softness still at the edge of his chitin, was not steeling itself at all. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a door he already knows he isn't going to walk through. "You," Ren said to him, gently, the first gentle thing she'd said all morning. "What's your name?" "Do not answer her," Vrail snapped. The young soldier's mandibles parted, closed, parted again. "Private Ithek," he said, so quietly it barely carried the 8 meters between them, and 3 of the soldiers on either side of him flinched at the sound of it as if he'd fired the rifle already. "Ithek," Ren repeated, holding the sound of it the way you'd hold something breakable. "You don't have to be part of this. Nobody's counting rifles once the volley's done. Point yours a hand-width high. I won't say anything. Neither will anyone else standing here, because every one of these people," and now her voice did carry, out past the firing line to the rope, and the crowd pressed silent behind it. Mothers and minors and the 2 compact appointed overseers who'd been forced to stand in the front row as an example, understands exactly what it costs a young man to refuse an order in front of his sergeant, and exactly what it's worth when he does it anyway. Calver's rifle swung sideways off Ren entirely to level at Ithek's flank. "Private, full aim now." "I have full aim, Sergeant," Ithek said, and his voice did not shake nearly as much as Ren had expected it to. "I said I have it. I did not say where." For one suspended second nobody in the square moved, not the firing line, not the crowd, not Vrail with the data slate frozen halfway to his side, and Ren Calloway stood at the ash-colored wall with her dislocated wrist screaming inside a restraint band that no longer had anything to hold, and thought, with the calm, procedural clarity Silas had spent 2 years building into her like a spine. "Good, that's one. Now I need 6 more minutes." Vrail reached the young soldier in 4 strides and struck the barrel of his rifle down with an open claw, hard enough that the muzzle cracked against the cobblestones. "You are relieved," he said, low and furious, the kind of fury that came from being frightened in front of witnesses. "Sergeant Calver, escort Private Ithek to the garrison for processing. Bring me a replacement from the reserve line." "Sir." Calver didn't move to comply immediately, and something passed between the 2 officers that Ren couldn't read from 8 meters. Not defiance exactly, more like a man watching his commander make a mistake and deciding, in real time, whether saying so was worth what it would cost him. He decided against it. He took Ithek by the shoulder guard and walked him off toward the garrison gate, and the young soldier went without resisting, without looking back at the wall, his mandibles pressed shut in a line that Ren recognized from every version of shame she had ever seen on any species. The particular stillness of someone who has just discovered what he is made of and does not yet know if he likes it. 6 rifles remained on the line. A 7th soldier jogged up from the garrison gate a minute later to fill the gap, older, heavier in the thorax, unbothered. The reserve troops tended to be the ones who'd already made whatever peace they were going to make with this posting, for better or worse. Vrail turned back to Ren, and for a moment his composure slipped entirely, the data slate trembling almost imperceptibly in his claw. "You cost me a soldier in front of 600 civilians." "You cost yourself a soldier," Ren said. "I just asked him a question you didn't want answered." "Enough theater." Vrail snapped his mandibles at 2 of the garrison guards flanking the crowd rope. "Cut her down. Bring her to the processing house. The execution will proceed on schedule. After I have had a proper conversation with the corporal about exactly how much of my supply depot has walked off in the last 2 months, and exactly whose hands it walked into." They cut the restraint band rather than unlock it, which told Ren 2 things at once. That Vrail had noticed something was wrong with her wrist and didn't want to waste time finding out what, and that he had just handed her another 20 minutes of daylight she hadn't had a minute ago. She let herself be marched across the square with her ruined hand cradled against her stomach, past the silent crowd, past a woman near the front, Ilsa Marsh, who ran the settlement's water reclamation plant and who had, 3 weeks ago, hidden 2 demolition charges inside a spare filter housing at Ren's request, whose eyes met hers for exactly as long as it took to convey nothing at all, which was itself a message. Understood, continuing, don't worry about us. The processing house had been the colony's assay office before the occupation, a squat stone building with good thick walls and worse ventilation, and Vrail had it cleared of garrison staff before he sat down across a scarred table from Ren, flanked by 2 guards, and set the data slate down between them like a weapon. You have 11 months of intelligence in your head, he said. Depot inventories, resistance cell structure, communication frequencies. I'm prepared to trade all of it right now for your life. Not your freedom, your life. You will live out your sentence in a labor camp on the equatorial continent instead of dying in that square in 40 minutes. This is a generous offer, Corporal, and I am only making it once. Ren looked at the offer the way she'd have looked at a piece of farm equipment somebody was trying to sell her too cheap. You're not offering me a trade, she said. You're offering me an out so you don't have to walk your soldiers back to that wall. You've got a reserve line spooked before the volleys even happened. You know it. I know it. If I walk out of here to a labor camp, half your garrison spends the next 6 months wondering what you're hiding, and the other half spends it wondering what I told you. Either way, you lose. I could simply have you shot right here, unwitnessed, and tell the colony you were sent to the camp. You could, Ren agreed. And then in about 4 months, when I don't show up in a labor transfer manifest, and somebody's cousin in the equatorial camp writes home saying I was never processed there, 600 people who are currently pacified, your word. I read the reports too, stop being pacified, because they'll know for certain that your word means nothing at all. Right now they don't know that for certain. They suspect it. There's a difference, and it's the only thing keeping this colony as quiet as it's been. You'd be spending that to save yourself one uncomfortable morning. Vrail's antennae twitched, and for a long moment he said nothing, and Ren understood that she had just watched a man do arithmetic he did not want to be doing. You're very calm, he said finally, for someone 40 minutes from a wall. I've had practice. Being executed. Being told exactly how something's going to go, by people who are very certain, and then watching it not go that way. She shifted in the chair, testing the new angle of her wrist against her ribs, cataloging the pain the way Silas had taught her, information, not injury, and let a small, genuine memory surface, because sometimes the truest thing was also the most useful one. There was a man on my world who used to say the Compact's biggest mistake wasn't picking a fight with humans. It was reading our history and thinking the wars were the interesting part. He said the wars were just what happened when we ran out of other options. The interesting part was that we never actually ran out of options. We just decided, over and over, for about 11,000 years, that some things were worth running out for anyway. A philosopher. A groundskeeper, Ren said. Fixed my broken wrist once before either of us was in the militia, taught me the trick I used on the transport ride here. She let that land, watched Vrail's eyes flick involuntarily to her cradled hand, watched him understand a half-second too late exactly what he was looking at. He's dead now. Compact Patrol caught him 3 months ago running a message between here and the Aldana farmstead, 61 years old. Took 4 of your soldiers 11 minutes to bring him down, and they used every round they had left over from that engagement, finishing the job on a man who never once raised a weapon at them, because none of them wanted to be the one who got close enough to confirm the kill by hand. You know that story, Warden Prefect. I know you know it. It's in the same casualty log as Verge Station. She was lying about the 11 minutes. It had taken the patrol under 4, and she hadn't been there. Only heard the account secondhand from the boy who found the body, but the shape of the lie sat exactly on top of the shape of the truth, and that was all it needed to do. Silas Boone actually was dead. That part cost her nothing to say plainly, and it showed, and she let it show, because a lie wrapped around a real grief was the only kind that ever survived contact with someone paying attention, and Asa Vrail, whatever else he was paying attention. "I'm not going to be talked out of a lawful sentence by a story about an old man," Vrail said, but his voice had lost the edge it carried in the square, and he closed the data slate with more care than the gesture required. "Guards, return the corporal to the wall. We finished this before local noon, as scheduled, exactly as I said we would." He rose, chitin scraping against the chair's edge, and paused at the door long enough to look back at her with something that was not quite fear and not quite respect, and had elements of both. "For your sake, Corporal, I hope the rest of that story about running out of options is true, because in 40 minutes you are going to run out of them completely." "We'll see," Wren said, and did not smile this time because there was no need to. The seed was planted, the minutes were spent, and somewhere 3 kilometers away under the Fenner shaft, the clock she actually cared about was still running. They walked her back to the wall through a crowd that had grown, not shrunk. In the 20 minutes she'd been gone, word of what happened to Ithek had moved through Sable Creek, the way word always moved through a small mining town, faster than any compact broadcast could contain it, and the 600 colonists behind the rope had become closer to 700, packed shoulder to shoulder in the cold, silent in a way that was no longer only fear. The replacement soldier standing in Ithek's old slot was heavier, older, a garrison veteran named Tosk who had, according to the depot gossip Wren had spent months collecting, survived 2 tours on a border world before rotating to what everyone called the easy posting. He held his rifle like a man who had held a great many rifles and had made his peace with what that meant a long time ago. He did not look rattled. He looked, if anything, faintly annoyed, the way a man is annoyed by a delayed shift change, and Wren understood immediately that Tosk was going to be a harder problem than Ithek had been, not because he was crueler, but because he had already decided, someplace deep and settled, that this was simply a task, and tasks got done. "Sergeant Calver," Vrail said, taking his position at the edge of the line once more, data slate returned to his side like a sheathed blade. "We do not stop again. Ready arms." 6 rifles rose, Tosk smooth and unhesitating, the other 5 with the particular stiffness of soldiers holding a line by discipline rather than conviction. Wren let her eyes travel the crowd once briefly, and found what she was looking for near the rope's edge. An old man, 70 if he was a day, leaning on a cane fashioned from a length of scaffold pipe, watching the firing line with the flat, unblinking attention of someone who had buried people before, and intended to remember exactly how this one went if it came to that. Henrik Voss had run the Sable Creek assay office for 30 years before the occupation turned it into a processing house, and he had, 3 weeks ago, walked 11 kilometers in a snowstorm to carry a message Wren couldn't risk sending by radio. She did not look at him twice. Looking twice was how you got someone shot. "Corporal Calloway," Vrail said, "you have exhausted my patience and I suspect your own cleverness. Do you have anything further to say, or shall we proceed?" "One thing," Wren said. "Tosk." The heavy soldier's head turned a fraction, not the whole thorax, just the head, the reflex of a name landing somewhere it hadn't been invited. "Borderworld veteran, 2 tour. You've killed things that fought back before. I can see it in how you're holding that rifle. You're not scared of me, and you shouldn't be, not the way Ithek was. But I bet good currency you've never once in either of those tour killed something that wasn't trying to kill you back. That's a different kind of mourning than the ones you're used to. It doesn't show on the outside right away. It shows up later, 3 weeks from now, 6 months from now, at a mess hall table when you're not looking for it." She kept her voice level, almost kind. "I'm not asking you to miss. I'm just telling you what Tuesday's going to feel like." Tosk's mandibles clicked once, and this time the sound did not go unnoticed by the soldier beside him. "She is attempting the same maneuver on every soldier in turn," Vrail announced to the line, loud enough to carry, an officer narrating his own certainty in the hope that certainty was contagious. "It is a documented psychological tactic. It has no bearing on your duty. Ready." Arms. He drew a slow breath through his spiracles, and Ren watched him gather himself the way she'd watched him gather himself once already this morning, and understood that this time there would be no interruption, no interrogation, no clever offer. This time he intended to finish it. Then, from somewhere beyond the garrison wall, low and distant and wrong in a way that every head in the square registered before any single person could name why, the ground gave a soft, deep shudder, and a column of gray dust rose lazily over the eastern ridge where the Fenner mineshaft cut into the hillside a full 3 kilometers outside town. It was not the sound of demolition charges going off in a controlled sequence. Ren knew that sound. She had helped plan it, time to happen after dark, time to cripple the garrison's fuel depot without a single colonist within 2 kilometers of the blast radius. This was earlier, smaller, wronger, 1 charge, maybe 2, gone off ahead of schedule, which meant either an accident in the tunnels or, worse, that someone down there had been discovered and had made the only choice left available. For one unguarded half-second, something crossed Ren's face that had not crossed it once since the rifles first came up. Not fear for herself. She had made her peace with that hours ago in the dark of the transport. But the specific, sickening lurch of not knowing whether 4 people she loved were alive 3 kilometers away, and Silas Boone's voice arrived in her head anyway, unbidden, the way it always did in the half-second before panic could take root. Information, not injury. You don't know yet. Don't grieve what you don't know. Vrail's head had snapped toward the ridge, antennae rigid, and for one crucial moment his attention left the wall entirely. Report, he snapped into his wrist comm. What in the compact's name was that? Static answered him first, then a garrison voice, thin and urgent. Warden Prefect, explosion at the Fenner Shaft Depot Annex. Unclear cause. We have movement in the tunnels, unconfirmed hostiles, request immediate. Later, Vrail cut the channel, and when he turned back to the wall his composure had frayed into something harder and more frightened, the exact combination that made officers, in Ren's long experience of them, most dangerous. Sergeant, we are not delaying this a second time for whatever theater the resistance is staging to save her. Fire. Now. All of you together, on my mark. Ren straightened against the wall, not defiant, not pleading, simply present, the way she had been present for every minute of this morning, and found Tosk's eyes down the line, and Calver's beside him, and 5 other sets of compound eyes catching amber light between them, and understood in the marrow of her that the 6 minutes she'd bought were the only 6 minutes she was ever going to get, and that whatever came next, the timing of it was no longer hers to control. Mark, Vrail said. The square held its breath. 700 colonists and 6 armed strangers and 1 unarmed woman with a wrist that no longer bent the way a wrist should, all of them waiting on the same half-second, and then the rifles fired. It was not 7 rifles. It was 4. 2 of the 6 soldiers on the line, a slight, quick-moving private near the end and a garrison veteran beside Calver, did not fire at all, their weapons frozen at full aim, hands locked, whatever discipline had gotten them this far simply refusing to complete the last motion. A third fired wide, the bolt scoring the ash-colored wall a full meter to Ren's left, close enough to shower her cheek with chipped stone but nowhere near her body, and Ren would never know, and never asked to know, whether that had been fear or mercy or simply a hand that had never been steady to begin with. That left 3 true shots, and of those 3 only 2 found her. The first took her high in the left shoulder, a white-hot line of pressure that turned, half a heartbeat later, into the particular seared-numb absence compact energy weapons left in their wake. The bolt cauterized as it burned, sealing the wound shut even as it tore through muscle, so that the blood she should have lost in the first 10 seconds simply didn't come, not yet, not the way it would have from a projectile round. The second caught her low on the right side below the ribs, a deeper hit, and this one buckled her knees and sent her down against the wall in a controlled collapse that looked, to 700 watching colonists, exactly like a woman finally, mercifully dying. It looked that way to Vrayl too. It was meant to. Wren had known, going into this morning, exactly what the medical logs said about compact energy weapons, and exactly what they didn't say, because the logs had been written by compact physicians extrapolating from Ketran anatomy, cross-referenced against 6 other client species in the compact's long catalog. And not one line of any of it accounted for the fact that a human chest cavity carried its heart and lungs in a completely different arrangement than the center mass diagrams the garrison trained against, or that human bone density and the particular redundancy of a human's major vessels meant that a wound which would have dropped a Ketran permanently within seconds could, in a body built for a world that had spent 11,000 years trying to kill everything living on it, simply be survived badly, painfully, on a clock that was now measured in single minutes rather than none at all, but survived. She let herself lie against the base of the wall, unmoving, breath shallow and controlled rather than absent, and cataloged the damage the way Silas had taught her to catalog everything. Shoulder, cauterized, arm still answering if she asked it to. Ribs, at least one cracked from the impact if not the bolt itself. The low hit, worse, something warm finally beginning to spread beneath the seared edges of it, meaning the clock on that one really was running now. She had perhaps 3 minutes of real usefulness left in her body. She intended to spend every second of them. "Confirm," Vrayl said, and his voice, for the first time all morning, had gone thin. Nobody moved. "Confirm the kill," he said again louder, and swept his gaze down the line past Tosk, whose rifle had lowered a few degrees without his seeming to notice, past Calver, whose mandibles had not stopped their soft, rapid clicking since the moment the bolts left the barrels, past the 2 who had refused to fire at all, standing rigid, weapons still raised at a target that had already gone down. Someone walk over there and confirm the kill. That is the regulation. That is the entire point of the regulation. Sir, Calver's voice had none of its earlier steadiness left in it. With respect, nobody at Verge Station wanted to confirm the kill either. That's rather the reason we're all still discussing Verge Station. She is unarmed, she is bound. She has taken 2 direct hits to center mass and she is not moving. Vrayl's antennae had gone rigid, and beneath the fury Wren could hear, with the particular clarity that came from having spent 11 months studying exactly this species under exactly this kind of pressure, something closer to pleading. Somebody. Confirm. It was Henrik Voss, 70 years old, leaning on his scaffold pipe cane at the front of the rope line, who broke the silence that followed, not with a weapon, not with a word aimed at soldiers, but with a sound Wren recognized instantly because she had grown up in a mining town and had heard it 100 times at burials. An old man beginning, low and rough, and entirely without permission, to sing the first line of the Miners' Rest hymn that Sable Creek had used to bury its dead for 60 years before the occupation ever came. It was not defiance exactly. It was worse for Vrayl and better for everyone else in that square, because it was grief given a shape the garrison had no regulation for, and within 4 words 24 other voices had joined him, ragged and quiet and growing, a crowd of 700 people finding, all at once, something to do with their hands and throats that was not screaming and was not running and could not be shot for. Vrayl's head snapped toward the crowd rope. Silence that. Now. The 2 guards flanking the rope hesitated. Wren understood even through the graying edges of her own vision, because striking a singing crowd of unarmed civilians in front of a woman they had just watched not quite die was a very different order than the one they'd trained for, and in the half-second bought by that hesitation, by the hymn, by Ithek's earlier refusal and Calver's quoted regulation, and every single minute Wren Calloway had spent all morning making this firing squad doubt itself 1 soldier at a time, she moved. Her right hand had never truly been bound, not since the transport, not since a dislocated thumb had let a 60 kilonewton restraint band slide off a wrist that no longer had the architecture the band was built to hold. It had simply been resting this whole time, cupped against her stomach as if in pain, which it was. That much had never been a lie, while the fingers beneath it worked, slow and silent and unhurried, at the release catch of the left-hand cuff. It came free 11 seconds after Henrik Voss started singing. Ren Calloway, shot twice, one rib cracked, blood finally beginning in earnest beneath a wound that would kill her in perhaps 90 seconds if nobody did anything more about it, opened her eyes, planted her free hand flat against the frozen cobblestones and rose. Tosk was closest, already stepping forward to do what nobody else on the line had been willing to do, rifle swinging down to bear on the woman who was supposed to be a corpse and had just stood up instead. And it was that half-second of pure animal confusion. The Borderworld veteran's mind trying and failing to reconcile what his eyes were reporting with what 11 months of compact doctrine had told him was possible, that Ren used. She did not go for the rifle. Silas had drilled that into her on the very first night of training, 2 years and a lifetime ago. Never fight the weapon, fight the hand holding it, because the weapon has no fear in it and the hand does. She closed the distance in 3 steps that cost her more than she let show, drove her free hand up and into the joint where Tosk's foreleg met the rifle stock, and used his own forward momentum. He was already moving to close on her, already committed to redirect the barrel past her hip and drive her shoulder, the good one, hard into the softer chitin plating beneath his jaw. It was not a killing blow. It did not need to be. Tosk went down hard onto the frozen cobbles with the rifle skittering free of his grip, stunned and gasping through spiracles that had never been built to take an impact like that. And Ren came up out of the fall already turning, already reaching, the rifle in her hands before the second guard. One of the 2 flanking the crowd rope, moving now to intercept, had covered half the distance between them. She did not fire it at him. She held it level, steady despite the wound screaming beneath her ribs, and said, in the same flat, unhurried register she'd used all morning, "Put it down." He put it down. Calver had not moved from his position on the line, rifle still raised, but no longer aimed at anything in particular, mandibles working soundlessly. And when Ren's eyes found his across the 8 meters that had separated them all morning, she saw a soldier standing at the exact edge of a decision he had probably been circling since the moment he'd invoked Verge Station in front of his own commander. "Sergeant," she said, "you already know how this ends. You said it yourself before any of this started. Put the weapon down, and nobody else in this garrison has to find out the hard way." For 3 full seconds Dune Calver did not move, and in those 3 seconds the square around them kept unraveling in every direction at once. The 2 soldiers who had refused to fire stepping back from the line entirely, weapons lowered, faces turned away from Vrail as if distance alone could unmake the order they'd disobeyed. The crowd rope buckling as colonists who had sung a hymn 30 seconds ago now surged forward past guards too stunned to hold them back. And from the eastern edge of town, where the road curved down from the ridge toward the Fenner shaft, the low grinding note of engines that did not belong to any compact vehicle in the garrison's inventory, growing louder, closer, 4 of them. Moving fast. Calver set his rifle down on the cobblestones with the slow, deliberate care of a man laying down something heavier than its weight, and stepped back from the line. Vrail saw it happen. Ren watched him see it, watched the warden prefect's compound eyes track from Tosk groaning on the ground, to the discarded rifles, to Calver's empty hands, to the wounded, bleeding, upright woman who was, by every regulation and every survey report and every year of compact doctrine he had ever studied, not supposed to still be capable of any of this, and watch something in him finally break in a way that had nothing to do with chitin or bone. "This is not possible," Vrail said to no one backing away from the wall. "You were shot twice, center mass. You were asterisk shot. You aimed for a heart that isn't there," Ren said again. And this time there was no theater left in it, only exhaustion and blood and the particular flat honesty of a woman running out of time to be anything else. I told you that an hour ago. The 4 engines crested the ridge road into the square a moment later. Not compact vehicles at all, but converted mining haulers, armor-plated with scavenged depot steel over the last 6 weeks by 4 people who had spent that time getting very good at working in the dark. And off the back of the lead hauler came Petra Aldana's younger brother Daniel, 20 years old, and carrying a rifle taken off a dead compact patrolman 2 months before. Followed by 3 more colonists Wren recognized from the Fenner shaft crew, all of them moving with the particular controlled speed of people who had rehearsed this moment more times than they'd ever expected to actually need it. The explosion at the depot annex had not been an accident after all. Wren would learn later, lying flat on her back in the assay office with Ilsa Marsh's hands pressed hard against the wound below her ribs. It had been early, 6 hours early, because a compact patrol had nearly stumbled onto the tunnel entrance, and the resistance cell had judged correctly that a loud, deliberate charge set off on their own schedule was safer than a quiet discovery on someone else's. The fuel depot was gone. The garrison's 2 remaining patrol craft were grounded with it. And every soldier still wearing a compact uniform in Sable Creek that morning had just watched their entire chain of command's authority collapse in the span of about 4 minutes, in the middle of a town square, in front of 700 witnesses who would tell this story for the rest of their lives. Vrail ran. He did not get far. Daniel Aldana brought him down at the garrison gate with a tackle that owed more to raw fury than any training, and by the time Wren's legs finally gave out beneath her, not from the fight, which she'd survived on adrenaline and stubbornness, and the last reserves of a body Silas Boone had spent 2 years teaching to keep functioning past the point most bodies quit, but from the simple, unglamorous arithmetic of blood loss finally catching up to intention. The warden prefect of Sable Creek's occupation garrison was face down in the frost with Calver's discarded restraint band cinched around his own wrists, and the square that had been silent an hour ago was very much not silent anymore. "Stay with me," Ilsa said, hands slick and steady against Wren's side, voice pitched low and urgent, the voice of a woman who had learned combat medicine out of a salvaged manual because the compact had never permitted the colony a proper physician. "Wren, stay with me. You did it. You hear me? Look at me, you did it." "Wasn't just me," Wren said, or tried to. The words came out thinner than she meant them, the square tilting slow and gray at the edges. "Tell Ithek." And then the gray closed the rest of the way over, and she stopped being able to finish the sentence at all. She came back to herself in stages, the way Silas had once told her the body always did after it had been pushed past what it was built for: first sound, then light, then the specific, itemized report of everything that hurt, arriving in order of severity like a supply manifest nobody had asked for. The room was the assay office again, or what had been the assay office before it became a processing house, and was now, judging by the improvised drip line taped into the crook of her arm, and the smell of antiseptic and gun oil in equal measure, becoming something closer to a field hospital. Late afternoon light came slanted through a window someone had boarded halfway up. "There she is." Ilsa Marsh's face swam into focus above her, tired and unshaven eyebrowed and grinning in the specific, exhausted way of someone who had not slept and did not intend to until several more things had gone right. "You've got a cracked rib, a burn wound that's going to scar ugly, and enough blood loss that I'm keeping you flat for at least 2 days whether you like it or not. Don't argue with me. I watched you argue an entire firing squad into surrendering this morning. I am not losing to you over bed rest." "What's the count?" Wren said, because that was always the first question, the only question that mattered before any other question got to matter. "Colony, garrison, everyone. Everyone's alive who was alive an hour ago, on our side. On theirs, Tosk's got a concussion and a bruised jaw, and he's currently sitting in his own garrison's holding cell being guarded by a 16-year-old with his own rifle, which he seems to find more embarrassing than the concussion. The two who wouldn't fire surrendered without being asked twice. Calvers, Ilsa hesitated, and Ren, still swimming, still catching up, read the hesitation before the words caught up to it. Calvers in the next room. He asked to speak to you when you woke up. Said he'd wait as long as it took. And Vrail. Trussed up tighter than a solstice goose, in the old supply cellar, guarded by 4 people who each individually want to be the one who doesn't have to guard him anymore. Ilsa's grin faded a fraction. There's something else you need to hear before he talks to you, though. Danel found the garrison's broadcast rig intact in the depot they didn't manage to blow. Turns out the whole execution, square, wall, rifles, all of it, was being recorded live, meant to go out to 4 other settlement garrisons at local noon as a deterrence package. Standard compact procedure, apparently. Make an example, broadcast the example, watch everyone else fall in line. Ren closed her eyes. It went out anyway. It went out anyway, Ilsa confirmed. Danel didn't even have to do anything. The rig was automated, set to transmit on schedule regardless of what happened. Every garrison on this side of the 9th Register just watched their own regulations get quoted back at their own officers by a bound prisoner, watched a private refuse a direct order, watched a firing squad fail, and watched a warden prefect end up face down in the frost with his own restraint band on his wrists. Live. Unedited. On the exact broadcast schedule, they set up themselves to scare everyone into staying quiet. For a long moment Ren said nothing at all, lying flat under a boarded window with a drip line in her arm, doing the same cold arithmetic she'd been doing all morning, except now the numbers on the other side of the equation had gotten considerably larger. That means Compact Regional Command knows within the hour, she said finally. Which means they don't send a shrug. They send a relief column, and they send it fast, because now it isn't about one colony anymore. It's about whether the deterrence broadcast just became a recruitment poster. Which is exactly what Calver wants to talk to you about, Ilsa said. He knows their response timelines. Better than any of us ever will. Ren was on her feet within the hour, over every objection Ilsa had, one hand braced against the wall and the burn wound in her shoulder throbbing in time with her pulse, because Silas had also told her once, the last real conversation they'd had, 3 days before the patrol found him on the Aldana Road. That rest was a luxury you spent when you had it, not an entitlement you demanded when you didn't, and Sable Creek did not currently have it. Dune Calver sat in the next room with his own restraint band, voluntarily fastened, resting on the table in front of him rather than his wrists. A gesture. Ren understood the moment she saw it, aimed less at safety than at making a statement to anyone who walked in about which side of this he now considered himself standing on. You didn't have to disarm yourself, she said, easing into the chair across from him. I disarmed myself for the same reason you let yourself get captured at Copper Fork, Calver said, and the flat certainty in it told her he'd worked that particular piece out on his own, probably somewhere in the 2 hours since the square. Trust bought early is worth more than trust demanded later. His mandibles clicked, slow, considering. I'm not going to pretend I did what I did in that square out of some late conversion to your cause, Corporal. I did it because I have served 11 years in this garrison, and in 11 years I have never once seen a target fail to die from what killed you today. And when the universe hands you evidence that contradicts everything you were trained to believe, a soldier who ignores it is a soldier who gets the rest of his unit killed finding out the hard way. I am pragmatic. That is the whole of it. That's usually how it starts, Ren said. Doesn't matter much to me why the door opened. What matters is whether you're walking through it or not. Ilsa says you know compact response timelines. I know them very well, Calver said. And I am telling you now before you ask, that the nearest reserve column is 6 hours out by fast transport, and it will not be 6 soldiers this time. It will be 40, minimum, possibly with air support, and it will not be commanded by anyone interested in confirming a kill by hand. It will be commanded by someone whose only instruction is to restore the deterrence value of that broadcast by whatever means accomplishes it fastest. He met her eyes, and there was something in the gesture that had nothing performative left in it at all. "You have 6 hours, Corporal. I would spend them well." Wren sat with that for a moment, feeling the pull of the wound in her side, the drip line taped crooked in her arm, the weight of a morning that had already asked more of her body than it had any right to give twice in one day. And then, because 6 hours was still 6 hours, and 6 hours had already once bought a colony everything it needed, she reached for the depot map Calver had unrolled on the table between them, and started, very calmly, to plan the second fight. The depot Danel hadn't managed to blow turned out to hold more than fuel, 6 crates of compact riot suppressant, a working comms rig, 3 intact hover sleds, and more usefully than any of it, 11 months of garrison supply manifests that Calver walked through line by line while Wren sat with her wounded side propped against a crate, and a mug of something bitter and hot that Ilsa insisted on calling tea. 40 soldiers, Wren said, tracing the depot map with a finger that still wasn't entirely steady. Air support, you said. What kind? 2 light interceptors, if standard doctrine for a reserve column holds. Ground attack capable, but not built for atmospheric loiter. They'll run escort on the transport in, then set down to support the ground unit rather than circle. Calver's claw tapped the single road cutting through the ridge past 3 kilometers north of town, the only approach a fast transport could use without crossing terrain that would tear its undercarriage apart. There. That is the only way in that gets 40 soldiers here in 6 hours instead of 16. Everything else is foot travel through the Kettle Hills, and no commander sends a punitive column on a 2-day hike when the entire point is to arrive before word spreads further. So they funnel through the pass. Wren looked at the map a long moment and felt something settle into place behind her eyes that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular, unhurried clarity Silas used to call asterisk seeing the whole board instead of the piece in front of you. Ilsa, the riot suppressant in the depot, what's the dispersal range on a canister? 40 meters, maybe 50 with wind behind it. Why? Because it's designed for Ketron respiratory systems, and Ketron respiratory systems are exactly what's going to be riding in those 2 interceptors. Wren tapped the pass on the map, the narrow throat of rock where the road cut between 2 ridgelines close enough together that a hover sled could barely clear them with room to spare. We don't fight 40 soldiers head-on. We don't have to. We ground the air support before it ever gets a shot fired. We choke the pass so the transport can't turn around once it's committed, and then we let the column's own commander do the arithmetic I did on Vrail this morning. Except this time, he gets to watch it happen to someone else's garrison first, because that broadcast is still sitting on every relay between here and regional command, and I intend for it to still be running when his transport crosses into range. Calver's mandibles went very still. You want to run the recording again. During the engagement. I want the first thing that commander sees when his comms officer opens a channel to negotiate to be his own Warden Prefect's execution order failing in real time, on a loop, with a caption underneath it stating in plain compact script exactly how many of his own soldiers this garrison already convinced to put their rifles down without a single shot fired at them. Wren set the mug aside, and for the first time since she'd woken under the boarded window, something that was not quite a smile touched the corner of her mouth, cold and satisfied, and entirely without cruelty in it, the expression of a woman closing an account rather than opening one. I'm not trying to win a fight in that pass, Sergeant. I'm trying to make sure the fight never has to happen at all. Every soldier we don't have to shoot today is one less thing Sable Creek has to live with tomorrow. It took the better part of 4 hours to set Ithek, released from the holding cell he'd spent the morning in and given, on Wren's explicit order, a rifle back before anyone had finished arguing about whether that was wise, worked the eastern ridge with 2 colony teenagers who knew the rock face better than any garrison survey had ever mapped it. Tosk, still nursing the concussion Wren had given him and still, to everyone's quiet surprise, choosing to stay rather than run, helped Calver rig the suppressant canisters to a tripline system adapted from mining charges, and Daniel Aldana, who had not slept in over a day and would not sleep for several more, spliced the garrison's own broadcast rig into a directional transmitter aimed squarely up the pass road, so that anything driving towards Sable Creek from the north would be receiving Vrail's execution order failing in a continuous loop from the moment it came within 3 kilometers of town. Wren did not go to the pass herself. Ilsa forbade it in terms that left no room for argument, and for once, because a leader who could not tell the difference between stubbornness and necessity was, in Silas Boone's estimation, no leader at all, Wren let herself be forbidden. She stayed at the depot's comms rig instead, a headset clipped over one ear, watching a wounded soldier's version of a battle unfold in status updates and static, rather than in the frozen square she'd fought her own war in that morning, and found, to her mild surprise, that the waiting cost her more than the standing at the wall had. At 1740 local, the transport crested the ridge road exactly on Calver's predicted schedule, 2 interceptors running high escort in the thin afternoon light, and the pass did precisely what 6 hours of planning had built it to do. Calver's tripline system fired the suppressant canisters in a staggered sequence timed to the interceptor's approach vector, not the transport's, a distinction that mattered enormously, and that the column's pilots, flying standard escort doctrine at standard escort altitude, had no way to anticipate. The first canister vented directly into the low-altitude corridor both interceptors were using to thread the ridge gap, a soft gray bloom that looked, from the ground, almost gentle, almost harmless, nothing like the violence the garrison's own manuals promised suppressant would deliver against unprotected Ketran airways. It did not need to look violent, it only needed to work. The lead interceptor's pilot, coughing and half-blind inside a cockpit that had never been sealed against an agent calibrated for exactly his own species' respiratory chemistry, put his craft down hard and wrong on the only flat stretch of the pass road wide enough to take the impact, clipping the second interceptor's wing on the way in, and sending both of them skidding to a stop in a tangle of scorched undercarriage and drifting suppressant fog, neither craft destroyed. Neither pilot seriously hurt, both of them entirely, immediately out of the fight. The transport driver, seeing his air escort go down directly across the only road he had, did the only sensible thing left available to him and stopped. Ithek's team on the eastern ridge held their fire. That had been the instruction Wren gave before anyone left the depot, delivered in the same flat register she'd used on every soldier in the square that morning. Nobody shoots first. Nobody shoots at all unless the transport tries to force the pass or opens fire on us. We are not trying to kill 40 compact soldiers today. We are trying to make sure their commander understands, before anyone dies, that killing us costs more than it buys. It was, Calver would say later, the single strangest ambush he had ever been part of on either side of a rifle. 40 armed soldiers stopped dead in a mountain pass by 2 grounded interceptors and a wall of suppressant fog, and not one shot fired by anyone, while overhead, on a directional feed nobody in that transport could turn off or look away from, Asa Vrail's execution order failed on an endless loop against the pale afternoon sky. It took 11 minutes for a channel to open. "This is Column Commander Bresh Yarrow, Threll Compact 4th Reserve," a new voice said over the depot's comms rig, flat and hard, and entirely unlike Vrail's earlier bluster. The voice, Wren thought, of someone who had spent a career learning not to let fear show in a transmission, which told her plenty on its own about how badly this particular commander needed that discipline right now. "I am addressing whoever is responsible for the ambush on 4th Reserve personnel in the Northern Pass. You have disabled compact military assets and impeded a lawful column. Stand down immediately or face full engagement authority. Ren keyed the channel and let the pause before she answered run a beat longer than it needed to, because silence, she had learned this morning if she had never fully understood it before, was its own kind of weapon. Commander Yarrow, my name is Ren Calloway. I imagine you've been watching the same broadcast your warden prefect scheduled to go out at local noon. A long pause answered her, longer than the pause she'd given him, which told her everything she needed about who held the better hand. I have reviewed the feed, Yarrow said finally, careful now, the bluster gone entirely out of it. Then you already know two things, Ren said. You know that the deterrence broadcast your own regulations required didn't deter anybody. It convinced 2 of your soldiers to disobey a direct order, on camera, in front of 600 witnesses. And you know that I took 2 direct energy hits to what your medical logs list as center mass, and I am currently standing in a depot 3 kilometers from where your interceptors are sitting in a ditch, talking to you instead of lying in that square. I'd like you to sit with that second fact for a moment before you decide what full engagement authority is worth to you today. You are one wounded human with a captured comms rig, Yarrow said, but something in the register had thinned, the careful hardness of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to be doing out loud. I have 40 soldiers. You have 40 soldiers stopped in a pass, breathing suppressant residue, with no air support, watching your own chain of commands authority fail on repeat over their heads, 3 hours before local sunset in terrain you have never operated in, and we have lived in for 6 generations. Ren let that sit exactly as long as she'd let the silence sit before it. I'm not threatening you, Commander. I already won this morning's fight without firing a shot at anyone who wasn't already shooting at me first, and I'd genuinely rather not fight this afternoon's either. But if you push that transport forward, you should understand precisely what you're pushing it into, and precisely how it's going to look on the next feed that goes out to regional command. Because I promise you, there will be a next feed. This colony has gotten very good at making sure the whole compact sees exactly what happens here. The silence that followed ran long enough that Calver, standing at Ren's shoulder in the depot with his own headset pressed close, murmured, "He's checking with regional command. That's the only reason a column commander goes quiet this long before answering a direct challenge." He was right. When Yarrow's voice returned, it carried a different weight than before, not surrender, not yet, but the particular strained formality of a man who had just been told something by a superior that he did not like and now had to translate into terms he could live with. I require proof that Warden Prefect Vrail is alive and being held under compact prisoner protocols, not summarily executed. If you can provide that, I am authorized to negotiate terms for withdrawal. He's alive, Ren said, unharmed, fed, and considerably more talkative than he was this morning. You can speak to him directly in about 90 seconds, because I'd rather you hear it from him than from me. She nodded to Danel, who had already sprinted the length of the depot to the supply cellar where Vrail sat, still restrained, still furious, and returned him, half-dragged, wholly undignified, to the comms rig inside 2 minutes flat. What Vrail said into that channel, Ren would never fully learn, because she stepped back from the rig and let the conversation happen between 2 compact officers in a register and cadence she wasn't fluent enough to follow at speed. But she watched Vrail's mandibles move, watched the particular slump come into his thorax that she recognized now as well as she recognized any human posture of defeat, and she understood, without needing the translation, that whatever pride the warden prefect had left in him, he was choosing not to spend it lying to his own commander about the state of things in Sable Creek. He confirms, Yarrow said when the channel came back to Ren, and something in his voice had settled now, gone flat and careful, and resigned in the particular way of a man who has just decided which of 2 bad options is the less expensive one. Corporal Calloway, I am prepared to order 4th Reserve to withdraw from the pass and stand down the punitive action on the following terms. You return Warden Prefect Vrail and the 8 garrison personnel currently in your custody, unharmed, along with any compact material not already destroyed. In exchange, this column returns to its point of origin, files this engagement as a tactical reassessment rather than an active campaign, and Sable Creek is not subject to further punitive deployment for a minimum of 90 standard days pending Regional Command's review. 90 days isn't freedom, Wren said. 90 days is what I am authorized to offer, Yarrow said, and for the first time all conversation something almost like honesty crept into it. I will tell you plainly, Corporal, because there is very little value left in pretending otherwise. That broadcast is already 3 hours old, and it has already reached every garrison on this side of the 9th Register, and by tomorrow it will have reached considerably further than that. I do not know what Regional Command intends to do about the 9th Register in the long term. I know that spending 40 more soldiers in a mountain pass this afternoon, on top of the 8 I've already effectively lost to your colony without a shot fired, is not going to improve whatever decision gets made. 90 days is what I can give you today. I would take it if I were sitting where you are sitting. Wren looked at Calver, who gave the smallest possible tilt of his head, not quite agreement, but the closest thing to a recommendation an 11-year garrison sergeant who had defected 6 hours ago was willing to offer. She looked at Ilsa, standing in the depot doorway with blood still dried dark on her forearms from the morning's work, who said nothing at all, because this was not a decision anyone else in that room was going to make for her. 90 days, Wren said, and you take every piece of compact hardware out of this valley when you go, the interceptors in the ditch included. My people don't want your wreckage sitting in our pass as a reminder, and Vrail goes with you. I don't want him here either. Agreed, Yarrow said, fast enough that Wren understood she could have asked for more and gotten it, which told her something about exactly how thin the ice under 4th Reserve's confidence had gotten in the last 3 hours. The prisoner exchange will take place at the pass within the hour. I would ask, Corporal, for what it's worth from someone who will likely never speak to you again. How? 2 direct hits. Center mass. I have reviewed the footage a dozen times in the last hour, and I cannot construct a physiological model that explains it. Wren thought for a moment of Sela's Boone wrapping her hand by candlelight after the 11th dislocated thumb, of a groundskeeper who had spent 2 years teaching a scared, stubborn colony girl that pain was information and not injury, of 11,000 years of a world that had never once made anything on it easy to kill. You built your whole doctrine on the idea that if you hit something hard enough in the middle, it stops, she said. We come from a world that spent 11,000 years teaching everything on it, including us, that the middle was never where the actual argument happened. You're not fighting anatomy you don't understand, Commander. You're fighting a species that decided a very long time ago that dying on schedule was somebody else's idea, not ours. She reached for the channel switch. Get your column out of my valley. She cut the transmission before he could answer, and only then, alone at the comms rig with Calver watching her carefully from 3 feet away, did Wren Calloway let herself sit down on an overturned crate and finally, quietly, shake. The exchange happened at the mouth of the pass an hour later, in the flat gray light of a mountain evening coming on early. 2 lines of people facing each other across 40 meters of frozen scrub, 4th Reserve on one side, arranged with the stiff precision of soldiers trying very hard to look like nothing unusual had happened to them today, and on the other, a loose collection of Sable Creek colonists and defected garrison personnel who had not had time to arrange themselves into anything resembling a formation, and did not, Wren thought, look any worse for it. Vrail walked the distance between the 2 lines without being pushed, restraints removed at Wren's insistence 20 meters out. Not mercy exactly, she'd told Calver when he questioned it, but a calculation. A warden prefect returned to his own column in chains told one story, and a warden prefect walking back on his own legs, unbroken but unmistakably beaten, told a truer and more useful one. He stopped once, 3 meters from where Wren stood at the head of the colony line, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "I underestimated you," Vrail said finally. It was not an apology. Wren hadn't expected one and wouldn't have known what to do with it if it had come. "You underestimated the whole species," Wren said. "I'm not special, Warden Prefect. I'm just the one who happened to be standing at that wall this morning. Every colonist behind that rope could have done roughly the same thing, given the chance, because we were all built by the same 11,000 years. That's the part your reports keep getting wrong, and it's the part that's going to keep costing you, on every world you've got flagged ascending, until somebody in your command structure finally reads the reports instead of the doctrine." She held his eyes a moment longer, and then, because there was nothing left worth saying to a man she was never going to see again, stepped back and let him walk the rest of the way to his own line alone. The 7 other garrison personnel followed in a loose column, subdued, unarmed, none of them meeting the eyes of the colonists they'd occupied for 11 months, all of them except one. Ithek stopped at the halfway mark between the 2 lines and did not keep walking. "Private," Yarrow's voice carried across the flat scrub, sharp with something that was not quite alarm. "Rejoin the column." "I'm not rejoining anything, sir," Ithek said, and though his voice shook at the start of it, it steadied by the end, the way Wren had watched it steady once already this morning at the wall. "I refused a direct order in front of 600 witnesses. There is no version of 4th Reserve discipline where that gets quietly forgotten, and we both know it. I'd rather choose what happens to me than have it chosen by a tribunal 3 systems from here that's never once had to stand where I stood today." He turned, deliberately, and walked the remaining 20 meters to the colonist line instead, stopping in front of Wren with the particular careful stillness of someone who had thought about this decision for exactly as long as it takes to make an irreversible one, and no longer. "You understand what you're choosing," Wren said quietly for him alone. "No going back, not ever." "I understood that the moment I pointed my rifle somewhere other than where the sergeant told me to," Ithek said. "I'd rather live the rest of it here, on a world I'm apparently never going to fully understand, than spend it somewhere I do understand, doing the thing I did this morning to somebody who deserves it even less than you did." Calver's claw settled briefly on the young soldier's shoulder guard, the first gesture of something like camaraderie Wren had seen pass between the 2 of them all day, and behind them, Yarrow's column began its slow retreat up the pass road toward the 2 ruined interceptors, toward the transport that would carry them the 6 hours back to wherever 4th Reserve called home, and toward a report that Wren suspected none of them were looking forward to filing. She watched them go until the last hoversled cleared the ridge, until the low grinding note of compact engines faded entirely into the ordinary evening sounds of wind moving over frozen scrub, and only then did she let Ilsa take her arm and start the long, slow walk back down into Sable Creek, where 700 colonists were waiting to find out, in the fullest and quietest sense, what it actually felt like to have their town back. The town did not celebrate that night, not in any way the word usually meant. There was no bonfire in the square, no singing beyond the one hymn that had already done its work that morning. Instead, there was the quieter, more exhausting business of a community counting itself, tending its wounded, and beginning, in the particular unglamorous way real recoveries always began, to clean up the wreckage of a day that had asked everything of everyone in it at once. Wren spent most of that first night flat on a cot in the assay office, drifting in and out under whatever Ilsa's salvaged manual called for, and woke twice to find Henrik Voss sitting in the chair beside her, scaffold pipe cane leaned against the wall, saying nothing at all, simply present, the way old men who had buried enough people learned to be present for the ones who'd nearly joined that number and hadn't. On the second waking, she managed a full sentence. "Your hymn," she said, "this morning, that wasn't planned, was it?" "Wasn't a single thing about this morning was planned from where I was standing," Henrik said. "Except you. You had the whole thing planned down to the wrist, I'd wager, long before that transport ever pulled into the square." He studied her a moment, the frank, unhurried study of a man who had run an assay office for 30 years and had gotten very good at reading exactly how much a thing was worth by looking at it once. Silas would have been unbearable about it. Told everyone in town he taught you that trick himself, probably before you'd even finished healing. "He did teach me the trick." "I know he did." Henrik's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more the shape a smile left behind when the person wearing it had also buried the man they were remembering. "Doesn't mean he wouldn't have been unbearable about it." They held the memorial 3 days later. Once Ilsa judged Ren steady enough on her feet to stand through it without falling over, in the same square where the wall still bore the scorch mark from a bolt that had missed her by a meter. Somebody, Ren never did find out who, and never asked, because some kindnesses were better left uninvestigated, had scrubbed the frost-stained cobblestones clean of the morning's blood before the service, so that the two names read out that afternoon, Silas Boone and Petra Aldana, were spoken into a square that looked, for one careful hour, like nothing at all had happened there. Daniel Aldana spoke for his sister, short and plain and without much polish, the way people spoke when the grief was still too close to the surface for anything else. Ren spoke for Silas, and found, standing in the same spot where she'd stood bound and bleeding 3 days before, that she had almost nothing prepared and did not need it, that the truest thing she could say about a groundskeeper who had spent 2 years teaching a scared colony girl that pain was information, and not injury was simply that he had believed, long before she did, that she would survive whatever came, and had spent every lesson between them making that belief true rather than merely hoping it. He used to say the Compact's whole doctrine was built on a mistake, she told the crowd, her voice carrying flat and even across a square gone very quiet again, though this quiet had nothing of fear left in it. He said they read our history and thought the wars were the interesting part. I told the warden prefect that same thing 3 days ago, standing right here, and I watched him not believe me. I don't think he believes it even now. But every one of you standing in this square today believes it, because you lived it, and that's worth more to me than convincing a single Compact officer of anything ever will be. She looked, for a moment, at the scorch mark on the wall behind her, and then back at the crowd. Silas didn't get to see how it ended. I'd like to think he'd have found some other reason to be unbearable about it anyway. A ripple of something that was almost laughter moved through the crowd, the particular fragile kind that only shows up at the exact right moment in a grief too heavy to carry any other way, and Ren let it happen, let it move through the square and settle, because Silas would have wanted that more than he'd have wanted a eulogy that took itself too seriously. Trust did not arrive in Sable Creek all at once, and Ren never pretended it would. For the first 2 weeks of the 90 days Yarrow had bought them, Calver, Tosk, and Ithek lived in the old depot under an arrangement that satisfied almost nobody completely. Unarmed, unescorted after dark, permitted to work but not to wander, watched by colonists who had spent 11 months learning to fear the uniform, even 3 of the bodies that had worn it no longer chose to. The test came on the 9th day, when a crate of medical supplies went missing from the depot inventory, and half the settlement's suspicion landed, instantly and without evidence, on the 3 former garrison soldiers still living in it. Ren heard about it from Ilsa before she heard it from anyone official, which told her exactly how fast rumor could still move faster than fact even in a town that had spent a morning learning what patience under fire actually looked like. She found the crate herself within an hour, misfiled by a 14-year-old stock boy under a shelf of mining picks, nothing more sinister than a tired child's mistake at the end of a long shift. And she made a point, deliberate and unhurried, of walking the recovered crate through the center of town in full view before she ever said a word about where she'd found it, because Silas had taught her that an accusation left uncorrected did more damage in a week than most actual crimes did. And a colony that had just spent everything it had proving what it could survive was not going to spend the peace that followed tearing itself apart over a misplaced shelf of bandages. "You didn't have to do that publicly," Calver said afterward, watching her set the crate down at the depot door with the same flat economy of motion she'd used on everything since the wall. "I did actually," Wren said. "You three are going to spend the next several months being the first thing this town blames whenever anything goes wrong, whether you did it or not, because that's what fear does even after the thing you were afraid of stops being true. I can't fix that by telling people to trust you. I can only fix it slowly, by making sure every time the evidence says you didn't do something, the whole town hears it as loud as they heard the accusation." She studied him a moment. "You're going to be here a long time, Sergeant. Might as well start it on solid ground." By the fourth week, Ithek had a proper bunk in the depot annex instead of a cot in the corner, and had started, tentatively, teaching two of the colony's younger scouts what he knew of compact patrol patterns, information that turned out to be worth considerably more than anyone had expected from a soldier who'd served less than a year. By the sixth week, Tosk, gruff, unsentimental, still nursing what Ilsa insisted was permanent minor hearing damage in one auditory membrane from Wren's shoulder, had taken over maintenance of the depot's remaining hover sleds with the particular quiet competence of a man who had found, entirely by accident, something to be useful at that didn't involve pointing a rifle at anyone. The broader news, when it came through Calver, who still had access to enough of 4th Reserve's old comms protocols to listen in on regional traffic without being able to transmit back. A one-way window, he called it, better than nothing and considerably less than he'd have liked. What filtered through over the following weeks painted a picture larger than Sable Creek had any way of confirming on its own. The broadcast had, exactly as Wren predicted, reached every garrison on the 9th Register and several sectors beyond it, and in at least 3 other settlements. Calver was careful to say at least, because a one-way window showed him only what happened across it. Colonists who had watched a bound woman argue a firing squad into surrendering had found their own courage for their own reasons, in their own ways, none of them identical to Sable Creek's morning, and all of them, in Calver's flat professional assessment, considerably harder for a stretched, compact garrison to suppress once the idea itself was loose. "Regional Command has reclassified the 9th Register," Calver told her in the 7th week, reading off a transcript he'd copied by hand because he trusted paper more than he trusted any system that could be traced. "Hazard Index revised upward. Deployment recommendation changed from pacification feasible with standard garrison strength to containment only minimum viable presence, awaiting further doctrine review." He looked up from the page. "In plain terms, Corporal, they are no longer trying to hold this world. They are trying to decide whether it is still worth the soldiers it costs to watch it." Wren turned that over for a long moment, sitting on the depot steps in the thin, clean cold of a mountain autumn coming on, watching Ithek run drills with 2 colony teenagers across the yard, and Tosk swear cheerfully at a hoversled engine that refused to catch. It was not victory, not the kind that ended things cleanly, not the kind the old stories back on Earth had promised her as a girl before any of this began. It was something smaller and more honest than that. A door left slightly open where before there had been a wall, bought one delayed volley, one refused order, one hymn, one dislocated thumb at a time, by people who had never once needed to be angry to be dangerous. "Good," she said finally. "Let them keep deciding. Every week they spend deciding is a week this valley gets to spend rebuilding instead of burying." The assassin came in the 9th week, in the gray hour before dawn, and very nearly succeeded, because he did not come as a soldier at all. Wren had taken to sleeping in the depot annex those nights rather than her own house on the north edge of town, close to the comms rig, close to the maps Calver kept updating with whatever fragments crossed his one-way window. And it was that habit, more than any instinct, that put her in a room with a working weapon in reach when the door she'd bolted from the inside opened anyway, quiet as a held breath. Admitting a shape too narrow and too careful to be anyone from Sable Creek, moving through their own depot at that hour. She did not sit up. Silas had drilled that into her too once, on a night she'd never expected to need it. The half-second you spend proving to yourself that something's wrong is a half-second you've already given away. Move on the doubt, not the certainty. And so she was already rolling off the cot's far side, low, fast, reaching for the rifle she kept propped within arm's reach every night since the pass, when the intruder's first shot took the cot itself where her chest had been a moment before. The shape moved like a soldier and dressed like a civilian trader, which told her, in the fraction of a second she had to think about it at all, exactly what regional command had decided to risk instead of another column. Not an army, not a punitive force that would show up on any broadcast, but a single deniable operator sent quietly to remove the one name that kept turning up at the center of every uncomfortable report crossing a superior's desk. It made a colder kind of sense than 40 soldiers ever had. Wren almost admired it, in the brief clinical way she admired anything well designed, even as she came up behind the depot's supply shelving with her rifle, already tracking the gap between two crates where the intruder's next shot would have to come from if he wanted an angle at all. He didn't get a second shot. Tosk did, from the annex doorway, roused by the first report and moving with the particular unhurried speed of a man who had spent 2 tours learning that panic cost more time than it ever saved. A single suppressive burst that drove the intruder back from the shelving and into the open depot floor, where Ithek, coming in from the opposite door with nothing but a mining pick in his hands because he'd been closer to the tool rack than the armory, closed the last 4 meters at a dead run and brought the operative down hard enough to end it without a second round from anyone. It took less than 30 seconds, start to finish. Wren had time, afterward, kneeling over a stranger with a broken forearm and a mining pick's handle still pressed hard across his collar, to feel exactly one thing clearly, and it was not fear, and it was not fury. "You're not Garrison," she said, studying his face, human, she registered distantly, a fact that landed strange and cold in her chest in a way none of the morning at the wall ever had because it changed the whole shape of what this was. Contracted, off-world, somebody paid you. "Doesn't matter who," the man said, breath coming ragged around Ithek's grip. "You're a name on a list now. 9th Register, primary destabilizing element, priority elimination. Doesn't matter if I'm the one who finishes it. Somebody will." "Maybe," Wren said, and there was nothing in her voice that resembled triumph, nothing that resembled anger either, only the same flat, tired clarity she'd carried into the square 9 weeks earlier, because some prices, she was beginning to understand, simply didn't stop coming due once you'd paid the first installment. "But it won't be tonight, and it won't be you, and every name that gets added to that list after mine is one more piece of proof that the thing you're all so afraid of isn't going away. You should tell whoever's paying you that, if they let you report back at all." She did not kill him. Ilsa patched the broken arm the same way she'd patched Wren's ribs 9 weeks before, without comment, without the softness she might once have shown a compact prisoner, and without the harshness either, competent, unhurried, professional. And 2 days later, the man was walked to the edge of colony territory with enough supplies to reach the nearest transit relay and a plain warning that the next contractor who came through Sable Creek's perimeter would not get the same courtesy twice. "You let him go," Calver said afterward, turning the decision over with the particular caution of a soldier who had spent 11 years believing mercy was a resource armies couldn't afford to spend on enemies. "I let him go because killing him buys nothing," Wren said. "It doesn't put a name back on any list. It doesn't make the next one think twice. It just makes the next one better prepared. But a man walking back to whoever hired him with a story about how the asterisk destabilizing element on the 9th Register patched his arm and sent him home instead of burying him in the hills, that story travels. That story costs them something a body in an unmarked grave never would. She looked at Calver a long moment, and something in her voice, when it came again, was quieter than her usual flatness, closer to something Silas might have recognized as the actual root of everything he'd spent 2 years teaching her. "I'm not interested in being feared for cruelty, Sergeant. I already found out, 9 weeks ago in that square, that being feared for restraint works considerably better, and costs this colony a great deal less to maintain." The 89th day of the reprieve arrived cold and clear, with the first real snow of the season already dusting the ridgelines above Sable Creek, and it brought with it the one thing Wren had spent 9 weeks trying not to let herself expect: silence, unbroken and ordinary, the sound of a colony going about its business with no transport engines grinding up the pass road, and no broadcast rig lit with an incoming priority channel. She had not let the town relax into that silence too early. Ithek's scouts still ran the ridge lines twice daily. Tosk still kept the hoversleds fueled and ready on a rotation that never varied by more than an hour. Calver still sat at the comms rig most evenings with his one-way window open, reading whatever fragments of regional traffic drifted across it, because Silas Boone's oldest lesson, the one Wren had internalized so completely, she rarely thought of it as a lesson anymore, only as the shape of how she moved through the world, held that the moment you stopped expecting the next threat was the moment it arrived. It nearly proved him right one final time, 4 days before the 90 days ran out, when Calver came into the depot at a dead run for the first time since the morning of the wall, transcript sheet still clutched in one claw. "Fleet movement," he said before Wren had fully turned to face him. "Regional command traffic unencrypted, which means they wanted it read. A compact battle group has been ordered to the 9th Register, 3 vessels, escort class, inbound in 6 days. He set the sheet down on the depot table, and for a moment his mandibles worked without producing sound at all, the particular struggle of a soldier trying to deliver news he did not yet know how to feel about. "Corporal, I do not know what this means. It could be the punitive response we have been dreading since the pass. It could be something else entirely." Wren read the transcript twice, slow, the way she'd learned to read anything that might matter more than it first appeared to. The battle group's designation was unfamiliar to her, but the accompanying orders, routine patrol reassessment, sector reclassification review, minimal engagement posture, carried none of the language Yarrow's punitive column had carried at the pass. No deterrence package, no garrison reinforcement directive. Something closer, if she was reading it correctly, and she thought she was, to an audit than an invasion. "They're not coming to fight us," she said finally. "They're coming to see for themselves whether the reports are true. Whether a colony that beat a firing squad and a punitive column really did it with a rifle and a hymn and a dislocated thumb, or whether somebody back at regional command is exaggerating to cover for losing control of a sector." She set the transcript down, and something in her settled into the same flat, unhurried calculation that had carried her through the wall, through the pass, through the assassin in the dark. "Which means the smartest thing this colony can do in the next 6 days isn't dig in for a siege. It's make sure that, when those 3 vessels arrive, every single thing they see confirms exactly what regional command is afraid is true." They spent the 6 days preparing not for war but for witness, clearing the square of any lingering wreckage from the morning of the wall while leaving the scorch mark on the stone exactly where it was, because a story with the evidence still visible carried more weight than one scrubbed clean for presentation, briefing every colonist, defector and native alike, on the simple, unglamorous truth of what to say if approached, which was nothing more or less than what had actually happened, and positioning nothing that could be mistaken for a military buildup, because the point, Wren reminded Calver twice a day until he stopped needing reminding, was not to look dangerous. It was to look exactly as ordinary and unbothered as a town that had already decided, months ago, that it was no longer afraid. The battle group arrived on schedule, on the morning of the 90th day, 3 vessels holding high orbit rather than descending, and it was not Commander Yarrow's voice that opened the channel this time but a new one, older, more measured, identifying herself only as Sector Auditor Kessa Than and asking, with a formality that had nothing of Vrail's certainty or Yarrow's strain left in it, for permission to send a single unarmed shuttle down to the square where the broadcast had originated. To conduct what she called, in language that made Calver's mandibles click softly at the sheer bureaucratic distance of it, a * field verification of anomalous engagement outcomes. Wren granted it. She met the shuttle in the square herself, standing at the same wall, beside the same scorch mark, in the same thin autumn light, and watched a compact auditor who had never fired a shot at anyone step down onto Sable Creek's cobblestones and begin, with a slate very much like the one Vrail had once read her sentence from, quietly and thoroughly, to write down everything the colony was willing to tell her. It took most of that day. By evening, Than had what she'd come for, and before her shuttle lifted back to the waiting battle group, she paused at the base of the ramp and looked back at Wren with an expression that held none of the fear or fury Wren had grown used to reading on compact faces, only something quieter and more difficult to name. "For what it's worth, Corporal," she said, "I do not think this sector will see another punitive column for some time. Audits like this one tend to end careers rather than begin campaigns, once command reads them honestly. I cannot promise you peace. I can promise you that whatever comes next, it will not come from anyone still believing the story your warden prefect believed when he read your sentence off that slate." "That's all we ever needed," Wren said. "Just for somebody to stop believing the wrong story." In the quiet that followed the battle group's departure, with the depot finally still and the whole valley exhaling for what felt like the first time in 90 days, Wren let herself sit with a memory she had kept mostly folded away since the morning at the wall, because there had never once, in all the weeks since, been a stretch of time long enough or safe enough to unfold it properly. She had been 19 the winter Silas Boone found her, 3 months after the first compact survey ships passed low enough over Sable Creek's valley to convince half the settlement that resistance was pointless, and the other half that it was the only thing left worth doing. And she had been, by her own later admission, mostly useless at it, quick enough on her feet, strong enough for mine work, and utterly unable to stand still under pressure without her hands shaking so badly. She'd once dropped an entire crate of blasting caps, rather than admit to the crew boss that her nerves weren't equal to the job. Silas had watched that particular failure from the doorway of the assay office without saying a word, and had found her afterward, sitting alone behind the ore-crushing shed with her back against the cold stone, and her hands still trembling in her lap, refusing to look at anyone. "Hands like that get people killed," he'd said, not unkindly, lowering himself down onto the frozen ground beside her with the careful, deliberate economy of a man whose knees had opinions about sudden movements. "Mine used to do the same thing. Different war. Longer time ago than you'd believe to look at me now." He'd taken her hand then, without asking permission exactly, but without forcing it either, and turned it over in his own scarred palm as if reading something written there only he could see. "You want to know the trick, or you want to keep sitting behind sheds feeling sorry for a body that hasn't betrayed you yet. It's only betraying you because nobody ever taught it different." She'd asked for the trick. It had taken 2 years to actually learn it, in the unglamorous, repetitive way real skills were learned rather than the way stories told it. Not one dramatic lesson but hundreds of small ones. Dislocating a thumb in a cold training yard until the 11th time didn't flinch. Holding a hand steady over a lit candle for longer each week until steadiness stopped being a decision and became simply what her hands did, standing still under Silas's raised voice, his sudden movements, his deliberately unfair provocations, until stillness itself became the reflex fear used to reach for and found, instead, something considerably more useful waiting in its place. "The compact's going to come here eventually," he'd told her near the end of that second year, On an evening not unlike the one she now sat through in the quiet depot, the whole valley briefly, deceptively calm. Might be years off yet. Might be sooner. When they do, they're going to bring doctrine built on every species that ever broke in front of them, and they're going to expect us to break the same way, because that's the only kind of data they've got. You're not going to be able to outarm them, Ren. Nobody in this valley is. What you can do, what this whole stubborn, ugly, magnificent species has always been able to do, going all the way back before any of us had a word for what a Deathworld even was, is refuse to break on schedule. That's the whole trick. That's the only trick there's ever been. It just takes 2 years of dislocated thumbs to actually believe it in your hands instead of just your head. He had not lived to see whether the trick worked. That was the part Ren still carried more heavily than any wound the wall itself had left her, sitting now in an autumn evening 2 years distant from that cold training yard, turning a scarred wrist over in weak lamplight the way Sila's had once turned it over in his. That the man who had spent 2 years teaching her exactly how to survive a morning like the one at the wall had been taken from her on an ordinary road, by an ordinary patrol. In the entirely unremarkable way most deaths actually happened, with no wall, no crowd, no him rising up to meet him, only 4 compact soldiers who would never know precisely how much of what happened at Sable Creek's execution 3 months later had already been written into the hands of the woman they'd captured, one dislocated thumb at a time, by a groundskeeper none of them would ever learn the name of. She thought sometimes that this was the actual shape of the thing the old Earth stories had never quite gotten right, that courage was rarely a single morning's decision, rarely a lightning bolt of resolve arriving exactly when needed. It was 2 years of unglamorous practice, paid for in small pains nobody else ever saw, banked slowly against a morning that might never come, and had, in her case, come anyway, exactly the way Sila's said it eventually would. The wall had only ever been the withdrawal. The account itself had been opened and funded years before any rifle in that square was ever raised. Winter came hard to the valley that year, the kind of cold that turned the mine tailings white and drove even the hardiest miners indoors by mid-afternoon, and Sable Creek spent it doing the slow, unglamorous work of becoming, for the first time in nearly a year, a town rather than an occupation. The garrison flag came down from the depot gate in the second week of the reprieve's aftermath and was never replaced with anything at all, which struck Ren, watching the bare pole from the assay office window one gray morning, as exactly the right amount of ceremony for what it meant. Calver stayed through the winter and, by spring, showed no sign of leaving. He'd taken over what remained of the garrison's old logistics function, repurposed now for the colony's own use, tracking grain stores and medical supplies with the same meticulous attention he'd once given troop rotations. And if any colonist still eyed him sideways at the market some mornings, fewer did with every month that passed. Tosk married, of all the unlikely developments the winter produced, a widowed mechanic named Fenna Dre who ran the settlement's second hoversled repair bay, and the two of them argued cheerfully over engine tolerances in a manner that struck everyone who witnessed it as considerably more dangerous than anything Tosk had done with a rifle. Ithek, youngest of the 3, spent the season mostly with the colony's children, teaching survival skills that had nothing to do with compact doctrine and everything to do with a boy who had discovered, at the exact moment he needed to, that refusing an order well was its own kind of courage worth passing on. He wrote to a sister he still had, 3 sectors distant, a letter he showed to no one and mentioned only once, in passing, to Ren, not asking permission, exactly, but wanting, she understood, for someone in this valley to know that some part of him still reached backward as well as forward, that defection had not erased an entire life lived before it, only added a second one on top that he had chosen for himself instead of having assigned to him. Ren never asked what the letter said. She only told him, when he mentioned it, that a man who could hold both those lives honestly in the same chest was probably the only kind of ally worth trusting with either one. Ren healed slower than she wanted and faster than Ilsa expected, the shoulder wound settling into a scar she never bothered to hide, and the cracked rib fading, by early spring, into an ache that only announced itself in the deep cold or after a long day on her feet. She did not return to militia command in any formal sense, because there was, by then, very little militia left to command that hadn't already folded itself back into simply being the town's own quiet, permanent readiness. A readiness Sila's Boone would have recognized instantly, because it was built the same way he'd built it in her, one deliberate lesson at a time rather than one dramatic speech. It was in early spring that a girl named Petra Marsh, Ilsa's niece, 12 years old, sharp-eyed and entirely too fond of climbing the depot's exterior scaffolding, asked Ren, with the blunt directness only a 12-year-old could manage, how she'd learned to get her hand out of a restraint band that was supposedly rated to hold it. Ren considered the question for a long moment, sitting on the depot steps in weak spring sunlight, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to answer it properly rather than deflect it the way she deflected most questions about that morning for the better part of a year. "Somebody taught me," she said. "An old man who used to run the assay office before it was anything else. He told me pain was information, not injury, and that the difference matters more than almost anything else you'll ever learn." She held out her hand, palm up, the old scar along the wrist barely visible anymore beneath the winter's healing. "Do you want to learn it?" Petra Marsh's eyes went very wide, very fast, in the exact way Ren imagined her own must have. Once, in a training yard she barely remembered anymore except as the shape of everything that came after it. Would it hurt? Yes, Ren said honestly, because Sila's had never once lied to her about that part either, and she wasn't about to start the tradition off with a lie of her own. "It'll hurt considerably. That's not the part that matters, though. The part that matters is what you decide to do with it afterward." She shifted over on the step, making room, and looked out at a square that had gone, over the course of one long winter, from a place people avoided walking through after dark to a place children climbed scaffolding on in broad daylight without a single soldier watching to stop them. "Sit down. I'll show you the first part. The rest takes longer than an afternoon, but every lesson has to start somewhere." The first real test of that spring lesson came sooner than anyone expected, on a morning in early summer when one of Ithek's newer scouts, a nervous 17-year-old named Corbin Reyes, who had joined the Ridge rotation only 2 weeks before, sent up the settlement's alarm flare over what turned out to be nothing more than a compact supply convoy running its ordinary resupply route between 2 garrisons further east, well outside Sable Creek's own territory and entirely uninterested in the valley below it. The town's response told Ren more about how far it had come than any single dramatic morning could have. There was no panic in the streets, no scramble of people running in 6 directions at once the way there might have a year earlier. Instead, the alarm brought a calm, practiced unfolding. Children shepherded indoors by whichever adult was nearest without anyone needing to be told twice. Tosk's hoversled crew moving their machines under cover on instinct rather than instruction. Calver already at the comms rig confirming the convoy's actual heading before the flare had finished burning out, and Ren herself walking, not running, to the depot's high window with the same unhurried economy of motion she'd carried into the square nearly 2 years before, because a leader who sprinted at every false alarm taught her town to sprint at every false alarm, and a town that sprinted at everything eventually stopped being able to tell the difference between an ordinary morning and a genuine one. It took 11 minutes, start to finish, for the all-clear to go out, and by the time it did, Corbin Reyes had worked himself into a state of visible misery at the depot gate, certain he was about to be relieved of Ridge duty entirely for raising a false alarm over a routine supply run. "You did exactly what the rotation is supposed to do," Ren told him, finding him slumped against the gatepost with his rifle held like something he expected to have taken away from him. You saw movement you didn't recognize. You didn't wait to be certain before you raised it, and the whole town responded like we drilled it 100 times because we have. That's not a mistake, Corbin. That's the system working exactly the way it's supposed to work. The morning it doesn't work is the morning somebody decides a false alarm 2 weeks ago means the next one isn't worth raising, and that's the morning this town gets hurt. She studied him a moment, 17 and mortified and entirely unaware of how closely he resembled a version of herself that had once dropped an entire crate of blasting caps rather than admit her hands were shaking. Go get something to eat. You did your job. Do it exactly the same way next week. He did do it exactly the same way, and the week after, and the one after that, and by the height of summer Sable Creek's ridge rotation had become, in Calver's professional and unsentimental assessment, a more reliable early warning system than the 1/4 Reserve's own garrison had maintained during its 11 months of occupation. Not because the colony had access to better equipment or better training in any technical sense, but because every person on that rotation understood, in a way no compact conscript ever fully had, exactly what they were actually defending, and exactly what it would cost the valley if they got it wrong. It was watching Corbin Reyes walk his ridgeline one evening not long after, steady and unhurried against a sky gone gold with the last of the day's light, that Wren found herself thinking, not for the first time, that this, the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of a town that had learned to take care of itself, was the actual victory the morning at the wall had purchased, far more than the broadcast, or the pass, or even the audit that had finally slowed the compact's appetite for punitive columns. A single dramatic morning could be undone by a single dramatic reversal. A town that had rebuilt its own instincts from the ground up was considerably harder to unmake. Word of the other colonies came slower than Wren expected, filtered through traders, and the occasional relay message Calver's contacts could still pull from the fringes of compact civilian traffic. But it came, and by midsummer a picture had assembled itself that none of them in Sable Creek had set out to build, and none of them could quite believe they'd built anyway. The settlement at Fenwick Hollow, 200 kilometers south across the Kettle Range, had staged its own quiet refusal 3 months after Sable Creek's. Not a firing squad this time, but a supply strike, colonists simply declining, all at once and without any single leader to arrest, to work the garrison's mines until a list of demands were met. And the garrison there, already unsettled by a broadcast it had watched live the same afternoon as everyone else, had folded inside a week, rather than risk becoming the next transcript on somebody's audit slate. The mining collective at Dorn's Landing had gone further, disarming its garrison outright during a festival the compact had permitted as a goodwill gesture, using nothing more than the numbers advantage of 600 unarmed civilians who had, Wren gathered from the second-hand account, simply walked toward the armed line and kept walking until the line backed away rather than fire into a crowd. The entire sector had by then learned not to underestimate. None of it added up to the kind of victory the old stories back on Earth might have promised. No fleet arriving in the sky to drive the compact off the 9th Register entirely. No single dramatic battle that ended the occupation in one afternoon. What it added up to instead, Wren thought, sitting with Calver over the summer's accumulated transcripts one warm evening on the depot steps, was something slower and considerably harder to undo. A sector where the compact could no longer be certain, world to world, garrison to garrison, which colony would be the next to simply stop being afraid, and where every officer who'd once relied on that fear to hold a posting together with a fraction of the soldiers' actual control would require was discovering, one report at a time, exactly how expensive its absence had become. They will not leave the 9th Register, Calver said, setting the last transcript down. Not this year, possibly not for several. Regional Command does not surrender territory over a bad quarter of reports. I don't need them to leave this year, Ren said. I need them to keep spending more than they're gaining every year, until the arithmetic finally does what arithmetic always eventually does. She looked out at the square, quiet now in the long summer evening, a handful of children, Petra Marsh among them, wrist newly practiced in the particular slow art of working loose from a rope tied by one of her friends, running some game across cobblestones that had once held a firing line. Silas used to say the compact's whole strategy depended on us believing the fight was already lost before it started. Every colony that stops believing that is a colony, they have to spend real resources convincing all over again. That adds up, it just adds up slow. Calver considered that, mandibles working softly, and said after a while, the thing that had apparently been sitting behind his composure for most of the summer without finding its way out. I have served 2 masters in my life, Corporal. The compact, for 11 years, believing every doctrine I was handed. And now this, whatever this is. A colony. A cause I did not choose so much as arrive at, one refused order at a time. He looked at her, and there was nothing performative left in the question at all. Was it worth it, what it cost you? What it is still costing this whole valley, slowly, every season. Ren thought about that a long while before she answered, watching Petra Marsh's small, determined wrist work free of the rope one more time in the fading light. Watching Ithek jog past on his evening ridge round with 2 of the colony's other newly trained scouts falling in step beside him. Watching a town that had spent a year rebuilding itself into something no single garrison would ever again mistake for simply pacified. Ask me again in 20 years, she said. I'll tell you the honest answer then. Right now I can only tell you it's still worth paying, one day at a time, which is the only way anything like this was ever going to get paid for anyway. The request from Fenwick Hollow came in late summer, carried not by Calver's one-way window but by an actual courier. A wiry, sun-cracked trader named Oscar Pell who arrived at the depot gate on a hoversled held together with more optimism than metal, asking, with the particular bluntness of a man who had ridden 2 days through the Kettle Hills to say it, whether the corporal who'd faced down a firing squad might be willing to come south and talk some sense into a garrison commander, who seemed determined to have his own version of the same morning, except with considerably worse odds attached. They've got 40 colonists rounded up in the square, Pell said, still catching his breath, and a commander who's decided the supply strike is sabotage rather than a labor dispute, and I'll tell you plain, Corporal, Fenwick Hollow doesn't have anybody like you. They've got good people. They don't have anybody who's already done the arithmetic on how a morning like that actually goes. Ren left within the hour, against Ilsa's muttered objections about a still tender shoulder and a valley that had only just learned to sleep through the night without watching the ridge road, taking Calver and 2 of Ithek's best scouts with her, and leaving Tosk, grown steadier every season, to hold Sable Creek in her absence. The 2-day ride south gave her more time than she wanted to think about what she actually intended to do once she arrived, since Fenwick Hollow was not her colony, its garrison was not Vrail's, and the particular leverage she'd built at Sable Creek, the broadcast, the reputation, the 6 minutes bought one soldier at a time, belonged to a specific morning that would not simply transplant itself 200 kilometers south because she showed up wanting it to. What she found, arriving at dusk on the 2nd day, was a settlement smaller and rower than Sable Creek had ever been even at its worst, a garrison commander named Prefect Das Ellenrick who wore his authority like a man still not entirely convinced it fit him, and 40 colonists held in a covered grain silo rather than a square, which told Ren something useful before she'd said a single word to anyone. Ellenrick wanted this handled quietly, away from witnesses, which meant he was already less certain of his own doctrine than Vrail had ever let himself appear. She did not walk in demanding an audience. She spent the first evening instead doing what Silas had always told her mattered more than any speech, listening to the strike's actual organizers, 3 miners named Cora Bet, Yusuf Adan, and a stone-faced grandmother everyone simply called Ma Halloran, learning the shape of the dispute before she ever offered an opinion on how to end it. The garrison had cut the settlement's medical allotment by a third to fund a new patrol wing nobody in Fenwick Hollow had asked for or needed. And the strike had begun, as exactly what it looked like: ordinary people refusing to work a mine that no longer valued their lives enough to keep their children in bandages. Before Ellenrich's own anxiety about appearing weak in front of regional command had turned a labor dispute into a hostage standoff inside 48 hours. "He's not Vrail," Wren told Calver that night, turning the problem over the way she'd have turned over a piece of unfamiliar machinery, looking for the seam that would open it. Vrail believed his own doctrine completely, all the way to the wall. Ellenrich doesn't believe it. He's just more afraid of what happens if he backs down in front of his own garrison than he is of what happens if he doesn't. That's a different lock. Doesn't open the same way. She requested the meeting the following morning, alone, unarmed, at the silo itself, and Ellenrich agreed to it with a speed that told her exactly how badly he wanted a way out of a standoff he'd backed himself into without meaning to. He was younger than Vrail, a reptilian species Wren had not encountered before, pale green scales catching the morning light, a low-ridged crest that flushed a deeper color when he was agitated, which it was doing almost continuously by the time she reached the silo door. "I am aware of what happened at Sable Creek," Ellenrich said before she'd said a word. "I assume that is why you're here. I want to be clear that I have no intention of repeating your warden prefect's mistakes." "Good," Wren said. "Then let's talk about what mistake you're currently making instead, because it isn't the same one, and pretending it is will get you exactly the wrong solution." She nodded toward the silo, toward 40 colonists visible through the gapped slats, sitting in loose, watchful clusters in the grain dust. "You didn't round these people up because they're dangerous. You rounded them up because you cut a medical allotment nobody asked you to cut. They stopped working in response, and you're now more worried about how backing down looks to your own command structure than you are about actually solving the problem you created. That's not defiance you're holding in that silo, Prefect. That's leverage you built for yourself by accident, and you don't know how to put it down without looking weak." Ellenrich's crest darkened further, and for a moment Wren thought she'd overplayed the opening. That pride, cornered, might do here exactly what it had nearly done in Sable Creek Square, dig in past the point of sense simply to avoid the appearance of surrender. But he said, after a long pause in a voice that had lost most of its earlier stiffness, "And if I release them, what does that cost me in front of my own garrison that a firing squad wouldn't have cost me?" "It costs you nothing if you frame it as the thing it actually is," Wren said. "You restore the medical allotment, you release the strikers, and you tell your garrison the truth, that a labor dispute over a resource cut isn't worth the political cost of becoming the next transcript on an auditor's slate, especially with 3 vessels worth of regional attention already circling this sector, because of what happened at my colony. You're not backing down from the colonists, Prefect. You're making a resource decision informed by sector-wide risk assessment. That's a sentence you can say in front of your own command without it costing you a single scrap of standing, and it happens to also be true." It took the rest of that day, and most of the following morning, 3 more rounds of careful, patient argument conducted in the flat, unhurried register Wren had spent 2 years learning from a groundskeeper, who never once raised his voice to make a point land harder, before Ellenrich finally gave the order to open the silo doors. There was no broadcast this time, no firing squad, no wall with a scorch mark that would outlast everyone currently alive to remember it. Only 40 tired, grain-dusted colonists walking free into an ordinary afternoon, and a compact prefect quietly restoring a medical allotment he would tell his own superiors, with perfect technical honesty, had never been worth the risk of cutting in the first place. "You didn't need to win that one with a hymn and a bleeding wound," Calver observed, as they rode back north 2 days later, the Kettle Hills gold and heavy with early autumn light. No, Wren agreed. Most of them you won't. Sable Creek was the hard version, the one where the officer in charge actually believed his own doctrine all the way down. Most of what's coming won't look anything like that morning at all. It'll look like this. Quiet, boring. A resource line moved on a ledger instead of a rifle raised in a square. She watched the ridgeline pass, the long, slow country between one colony and the next, and found, somewhere in the watching, a version of satisfaction that had nothing dramatic in it at all, which was, she was beginning to understand, exactly the kind that lasted. Silas used to say the flashy version of winning is the one people remember. The boring version is the one that actually holds. I'd rather have 40 more mornings like this one than a single morning anybody ever puts in a broadcast again. Asavrail came back to Sable Creek in the first hard frost of the following autumn, alone, on foot, having walked the last 11 kilometers of a journey that had apparently started far outside the 9th Register entirely. And Ithex's Ridge scouts brought word of the approach a full hour before the former warden prefect reached the edge of colony territory. Enough time for Wren to be standing, waiting, arms loosely crossed, at the same depot gate where a garrison flag had once flown. When 4 of Ithex's scouts marched him in with a wariness that had nothing gentle left in it at all. He looked smaller than Wren remembered. Chitin that had once carried the deliberate polish of an occupying officer had gone dull and travel-worn, and one of his antennae hung at an angle that suggested it had never been properly set after some injury nobody in Sable Creek had witnessed. "You're supposed to be under compact custody," Wren said. It was not a question. Calver's one-way window had carried word, months earlier, that the audit following the 9th Register incident had ended careers exactly as Auditor Than predicted, Vrail's chief among them, stripped of rank and command, held for review on charges that amounted, in the flattened language of compact tribunal records, to catastrophic failure of pacification doctrine resulting in sector-wide destabilization. "I was," Vrail said, "for 4 months. Then I was released with no rank, no posting, no further use to anyone, and a formal notation in every service record I will ever be able to produce stating precisely why." His mandibles clicked, slow, none of the certainty left in the sound that had once filled a frozen square with it. "I have spent the last 2 months trying to understand why I am here instead of simply going somewhere the compact's opinion of me does not follow. I do not have a complete answer. I have only the incomplete one, which is that I could not stop thinking about a woman who took 2 direct hits and stood up anyway, and I wanted, before whatever is left of my life runs out somewhere quiet and forgotten, to ask her directly what I got wrong. Not the doctrine. The doctrine was already wrong before I arrived here. I want to know what I got wrong, standing in that square, that a soldier with 11 years of service and a sergeant with none of my rank both understood before I did." Wren studied him a long moment, in the thin autumn light, with the whole town's cautious attention gathered loosely at the edges of the yard, Calver watching from the depot door with an expression she couldn't fully read, Tosk with one hand resting, not quite casually, on the tool he'd been using before the scouts arrived, Ithek standing closest of all with the particular stillness of a young man who had once stood exactly where Vrail now stood and understood, better than anyone else present, precisely what it cost to walk that far back from a mistake. "You mistook composure for weakness," Wren said finally. "That's the whole of it if you want the short answer. You looked at a woman standing still, not shouting, not begging, not fighting the restraints, and your whole doctrine told you that stillness meant she'd already lost. Every soldier you had standing behind those rifles knew better within about a minute, because soldiers who actually have to do the killing learn faster than officers who only order it that stillness is usually the most dangerous thing in the room, not the least." She uncrossed her arms, and something in her posture eased, fractionally, not toward warmth exactly but toward something adjacent to it. "You're not the first commander to make that mistake, Warden Prefect. You won't be the last. The only thing that separates you from all the ones still making it somewhere else in this sector is that you walked 11 kilometers to ask instead of filing another report. What happens now? Vrail said, and there was nothing left in the question but plain, tired uncertainty. Wren looked past him, at the town gathered loosely at the edges of the yard, at 700 colonists, closer to 900 now, with the refugees who trickled in from 2 harder-hit settlements further south over the past year, who had every reason in the world to want this particular reckoning to end badly for the man who'd once read a death sentence off a data slate in their own square, and found, in the collective quiet of their watching, not bloodlust but something more patient, waiting on her to decide what kind of place Sable Creek was actually going to be now that it had the freedom to choose. "You work," she said, "same as everyone else here who's ever needed a second chance and been willing to earn it instead of asking for it. Depot labor, under Calver's supervision, same rations and same rules as anyone else in this valley, for as long as it takes this town to trust you're not filing reports for anyone anymore. That's not mercy, Warden Prefect, in case you're tempted to call it that. It's the same arithmetic I gave your commander at the pass. Killing you costs this colony something and buys nothing. Working you costs considerably less and might, eventually, buy quite a lot." She held his eyes a final moment, and there was no theater left in it at all, only the flat, settled certainty of a woman who had finished, a long time ago, the sentence she'd started at that wall. "Welcome to Sable Creek. You'll find the work considerably harder than reading a slate." I imagine that's exactly the point. The town meeting to formalize Vrail's arrangement was held 2 nights later, in the depot's largest room, with close to 300 colonists crowded in past the doorway and Wren standing at the front not to dictate the outcome, but, for the first time since the morning at the wall, to let Sable Creek decide something this large entirely on its own. It was not unanimous, and Wren had not expected it to be. Danel Aldana, who had tackled Vrail to the frost with his own hands 2 years before, stood and said plainly that he did not believe a single season of grain hauling erased 11 months of occupation, and that he intended to hold his objection whether the vote went for or against it. Mahalloran's counterpart in Sable Creek, an elderly weaver named Odell Cray who had lost a grandson to one of the 4 executions Vrail had authorized before the morning at the wall, said nothing at all for most of the meeting, sitting with her hands folded tight in her lap, and when she finally spoke it was not to argue for mercy or against it, but simply to ask, in a voice gone thin with the effort of asking, whether the man now hauling grain 2 streets over understood what he had actually cost this valley, or whether the labor was, to him, still only a clever way of avoiding a worse consequence. Wren did not answer for him. She had learned, over 2 years of hard mornings, that some questions belonged to the people who'd paid for the right to ask them, and this was one of them. And so it was Vrail himself, standing at the back of the crowded room where he'd been permitted to attend on the explicit condition that he speak only if asked, who answered Odell Cray directly, in a voice that had none of the certainty left in it that had once filled a frozen square. "I understand it precisely as well as a creature who has never lost anyone the way you lost your grandson is capable of understanding it," he said. "Which is to say, imperfectly, and probably always will. I am not asking this town to forgive me. I am asking it to let me spend whatever years I have left being useful to the exact people I once considered a problem to be managed, because it is the only apology I know how to make that costs me something real rather than merely sounding like one." The vote, when it came, favored the arrangement Wren had already set in motion by 2 votes to 1, not overwhelming, not the clean, satisfying margin the old Earth stories might have promised, but enough, and Wren understood, watching the room slowly empty out into the cold night afterward, that the 2-to-1 margin was itself the truer, more honest outcome than unanimity ever could have been. A town that agreed completely about a question, this large would have been a town that hadn't actually reckoned with it. Sable Creek had reckoned with it, publicly, imperfectly, the way real justice was reckoned with rather than the way stories usually promised it would be, and that, more than any clean verdict, was the thing Wren found herself most quietly proud of as she walked home through the dark. The work did not transform Vrail into anything the colony mistook for a friend, and Wren never expected it would. Some distances, she'd come to understand over that long year, closed slowly if they closed at all, and the ones that closed fastest were rarely the ones worth trusting. But by the depths of that second winter, the former warden prefect of Sable Creek's occupation garrison could be found most mornings hauling grain sacks alongside colonists who had once stood behind a rope watching him read their neighbor's death sentence. And if the work was never once offered to him as anything softer than what it was also never once denied him the dignity of doing it properly, which was, Calver observed one evening. Watching Vrail argue with a supply manifest over a discrepancy he'd caught that a native colonist had missed, a stranger kind of justice than either species had much history writing into their own doctrine. At the wedding feast, held in the same square that had held a firing squad and a hymn, and later, a formal town meeting about the price of mercy, Henrik Voss stood on a crate with his scaffold pipe cane and led the gathered colony through the same rest hymn he'd started, unplanned and unbidden, on the morning everything in Sable Creek had changed. Except this time the voices that joined him did not rise out of grief or defiance at all, but out of the simple, ordinary gladness of a town with something worth singing about that had nothing to do with survival. Wren stood near the back of the crowd with Petra Marsh beside her, watching Ithek dance badly and without any self-consciousness at all with a woman who had chosen him precisely because of the morning he'd once tried hardest to forget, and thought, not for the first time, that Silas Boone would have found the whole scene unbearably sentimental and would have stood through every verse of it anyway, muttering complaints, refusing to leave. Ithek married the following spring a colony girl named Sila Okonkwo, who ran the settlement's small clinic alongside Ilsa and who had, by her own later account, decided somewhere around the second month of his Ridge patrols that a soldier who'd refused a direct order to save a stranger was worth considerably more attention than the uniform he used to wear. Calver stood witness at the ceremony, an honor that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier, and that nobody in the square that afternoon thought twice about by the time it happened, because 18 months, Wren had learned, was long enough for a town to rebuild not only its walls, but its whole understanding of who its walls were meant to keep out. Petra Marsh, 13 now and considerably more dangerous with a dislocated thumb than any 12-year-old had any right to be, started shadowing Wren on the depot's morning inventory runs that same spring, absorbing lessons that had nothing to do with cargo counts and everything to do with the particular, patient discipline of a girl learning, one small lesson at a time, that composure was a muscle same as any other, and that the muscle only grew through use. Wren caught herself, more than once that year, correcting Petra's stance with the exact same words Silas had once used on her. The body will believe whatever you tell it, yours especially spoken in the same unhurried cadence, and understood, each time she heard the phrase leave her own mouth, that she had stopped being only a survivor of what Silas Boone had built and had become, somewhere in the 2 years since the wall, the second link in a chain that had no obvious end in sight, and that this, more than any broadcast or any audit or any compact commander's grudging withdrawal, was the actual inheritance worth protecting. A single transmission arrived from Sector Auditor Kessa Than late that second autumn, routed through channels vague enough that Calver could never fully trace their origin, brief, and carefully worded in the flattened, deniable language of someone who understood exactly how much scrutiny her own career now carried. It said only that the 9th Register's reclassification had been formally upheld at the highest review level available to her, that 2 further punitive deployments elsewhere in the sector had been quietly shelved rather than authorized, and that she wished the corporal well. In whatever capacity, a compact auditor was permitted to wish a Deathworld colonist anything at all. Wren read it twice, standing at the depot's comms rig in the gray hush of an early morning, and felt none of the triumph such a message might once have promised her, only the same patient, unhurried satisfaction she'd carried out of the past negotiation over a year before. The recognition that nothing about this war, if it could even still be called a war, was ever going to end in a single dramatic reversal, only in a long accumulation of decisions like this one, made quietly, by people whose names would never appear in any broadcast, each one shaving some further fraction off the fear the compact had once assumed it could rely on indefinitely. "She's risking her whole career sending that," Calver said, reading over her shoulder. "Auditors do not typically maintain contact with the subjects of their own reports." "She's not risking it for us," Wren said. "She's risking it because she read the doctrine honestly once at that shuttle ramp, and it's hard to go back to reading it dishonestly after you've done that even one time." She folded the transcript and set it beside the others Calver kept, the growing, unglamorous archive of a sector slowly, unevenly, reconsidering itself one report at a time. "That's the whole strategy, Sergeant. It was never going to be one broadcast. It was always going to be this. A auditor who can't quite make herself lie in a report, a sergeant who quotes a regulation back at his own commander, a private who points his rifle somewhere other than where he's told. None of it looks like winning, most days. It only looks like winning if you're patient enough to watch it add up." And on a clear morning 2 years almost to the day after a firing squad had raised 7 rifles in Sable Creek's Market Square, Wren Calloway walked out to the wall alone, before the town had fully woken, and stood for a while in the cold beside a scorch mark that had never been repaired and never would be, because the colony had voted, in the plain, unglamorous democracy of a town meeting 8 months earlier, to leave it exactly as it was, not as a monument. Nobody in Sable Creek much cared for monuments, but as a plain fact standing in plain sight, the way a scar stood on a wrist that had healed around it rather than despite it. She thought of Silas Boone that morning, the way she still thought of him most mornings, briefly, and without the raw edge grief had once carried, because 2 years was long enough to let a memory settle into something closer to company than wound. She thought of Petra Aldana, whose brother now ran the depot's hoversled fleet with the same steady competence Tosk had once brought to it, having taken over the work entirely once Tosk and Fenna's second child arrived, and Tosk found, to his own visible surprise, that he preferred fatherhood's particular chaos to engine maintenance. She thought briefly of Ithak at the wall a full year before he'd found the courage to point his own rifle somewhere the sergeant hadn't told him to, and of how thin the line had actually been, that morning, between a firing squad that fired and one that didn't, thinner, she suspected, than any compact doctrine would ever be willing to admit, and thinner, if she was honest with herself, than she had let herself feel in the moment, standing at this exact wall with 2 bolts already burning through her. None of it had ended cleanly. She knew that as well as anyone in the valley, knew that the 9th Register still carried a compact garrison presence in 4 other settlements, knew that Sector Auditor Than's careful, career-ending report had bought a reprieve, and not a peace, knew that somewhere beyond the Kettle Hills, a new generation of officers was almost certainly being trained on exactly the failure Vrail represented, learning from his mistakes the way every institution eventually learned from its costliest ones. Which meant the next colony that stood where Sable Creek once stood might not get the same 6 minutes she'd bought with a hymn and a dislocated thumb. That was simply the shape of the thing, and Wren had stopped, a long while ago, expecting any different shape from it. What she had instead, what she stood in the cold that morning and let herself actually feel, for the length of one unhurried breath, before the town woke and the day's work started, and there were manifests to check, and a 13-year-old to teach, and a former warden prefect's grain quota to confirm, was a square that children climbed scaffolding in without fear, a former enemy hauling sacks 2 streets over because the arithmetic of mercy had turned out to be sounder than the arithmetic of doctrine, and a scorch mark on a wall that would outlast every person currently alive to remember exactly how it got there, standing as the plainest kind of proof that the morning she'd been told, with total certainty, that she would not survive standing here had instead become the morning this whole valley learned it could. She would not always be the one standing at this wall. That thought arrived, unbidden and unhurried, the way most of her clearest thoughts had learned to arrive over 2 long years of practice, and she let it sit rather than flinching from it. Petra Marsh would be a woman grown before too many more winters passed, steady-handed and stubborn, in exactly the ways a valley like this one would keep needing. And somewhere beyond her, children not yet born would inherit a scorch mark on a wall they'd never seen fired at. A story told second-hand until it thinned into legend the way all true things eventually did. That was not a loss. Silas Boone had taught her that too in the end, without ever quite saying it outright, that the whole point of teaching anyone anything worth keeping was to make yourself, eventually, unnecessary to it, and that a valley which no longer needed one woman standing guard at one wall was not a valley that had forgotten what the wall meant. It was a valley that had finally finished learning it. Wren Calloway rested one hand against the cold stone beside the mark, unhurried, unbothered, exactly the way she had stood there 2 years earlier when 7 rifles had first come up to find her. And then, because the day's work was waiting and the sun was finally clearing the slag heaps, she turned and walked back into a town that no longer needed her standing at that wall to remind it what it was capable of, and did not look back.